Hello friends, I am Mr. Ghost, and I am here to help you today. I know, you use these videos to fall asleep. So, before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from, and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable, and relax. Story 1. I worked at a small town pharmacy that closed at 8 p.m. on weekdays. The place was quiet, nestled on a corner of Main Street, where the only sounds most evenings came from an occasional car passing by, or someone chatting with the clerk at the neighboring convenience store. Most of my shifts were uneventful, and by 7:45 I'd already started thinking about locking up and heading home. It was one of those nights when everything felt like it would be routine. But then he walked in. The man came in just 5 minutes before closing, his footsteps deliberate as they echoed in the nearly empty store. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket that seemed too heavy for the mild evening air. His face was mostly shadowed by the brim of a baseball cap, and his hands were buried deep in his pockets as he walked up and down the aisles without grabbing anything. He wasn't looking for a prescription, and he didn't seem interested in any of the over-the-counter items. I kept a polite distance, working my way through the last few tasks on my register, but it didn't sit right with me. The way he wandered through the store made it feel like he was just killing time, watching the clock tick down. I tried not to let it bother me. After all, people came in at all hours, sometimes just for a chat or to pass the time. But there was something unsettling about him. The way he moved, always avoiding eye contact yet still aware of me watching him. When the clock finally hit 8, I did what I always did. I shut down the register and started my closing routine. I turned off the lights behind me, making my way to the front door. As I locked up, I glanced outside. He was standing across the street, directly in front of the pharmacy, watching me. His posture was rigid, almost as if he were waiting for me to finish. I felt a chill creep up my spine as I locked the final bolt on the door. I wasn't sure if he had been there the whole time, or if he had just walked out as soon as I started locking up. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I didn't have any reason to think he meant harm, but there was something too deliberate in the way he stood there. His eyes were fixed on me, not blinking, not moving, just staring as if he knew exactly what I was doing. I didn't want to linger, but I felt rooted to the spot. Nothing told me to stay inside out of his line of sight, and I obeyed. I backed away from the door and stepped into the shadows, hoping he couldn't see me through the glass. I don't know how long he stood there, but it felt like an eternity. I could see his figure outlined against the streetlights, like a silhouette in profile. My pulse quickened as I tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was waiting for someone, or maybe he had just noticed me locking up and decided to stand there for a while. But the longer I stared at him, the less convinced I became. He didn't shift his stance, and his eyes never wavered. It was as if he was waiting for me to make the next move. Finally, I mustered the courage to move away from the door. I quickly grabbed my coat and purse, then headed for the back entrance, which led to the alley by the pharmacy. I wasn't sure if it was the right decision, but I couldn't stand the thought of walking past him. I double-checked the back door to make sure it was secure before stepping out into the alley. As I emerged, I looked over my shoulder toward the front of the pharmacy. To my surprise, the man was gone. The street was empty. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, feeling both relieved and uneasy at the same time. Still, I couldn't shake the image of him standing there, unmoving across the street. It felt like he had been waiting for something, but I wasn't sure what. I wasn't even sure if I'd ever know. I took a deep breath and made my way down the alley toward the parking lot, my footsteps quickening with each passing second. My car was parked in the lot behind the store, and I was eager to get home. As I reached my car, I looked around one last time, half expecting to see him lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing, just the empty streets and the occasional flicker of a streetlight. The next night, when I arrived for my shift, I felt the familiar tension creeping in. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that I had overreacted. Maybe he was just some random guy who had been out for a walk and had decided to stop and look in the store. I couldn't let myself be paranoid. But as the hours passed and the clock edged closer to 8 p.m., I found myself constantly glancing out the window, watching for any sign of him. I was relieved when 8 came and went, and I locked up without incident. This time, I didn't see him across the street. The next few days went by uneventfully, and I started to think, maybe I had been imagining things. That was until the following week, when he showed up again. He walked in with the same slow, deliberate pace, wearing the same dark jacket and cap. This time, though, he didn't even bother to look around. He simply walked to the counter, his gaze locked on mine, and then asked for a pack of gum. I quickly rang him up, my hands trembling slightly, and he left without a word. I watched as he crossed the street and stood in the same spot, staring at me as I locked up once again. This time I didn't even try to hide. I stood at the door, meeting his gaze head on. I didn't know why he was doing this, but I couldn't keep avoiding it. For a moment, neither of us moved, just staring at each other across the street. Then, as suddenly as he had come, he turned and walked away. I stood there for a moment, watching him disappear into the night, unsure if I had just narrowly avoided something worse, or if it had all been a coincidence. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, and every night after, I made sure to check the street before I locked up, just in case he came back again. Story 2. It was one of those nights where everything seemed too quiet, like the world had settled into a deep hush. I was lounging on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I heard him knock at the door. It was late, too late for most people to be out and about, but I figured it was probably my neighbor, Terry. He had a habit of knocking on my door at odd hours whenever he needed help with something, whether it was a broken faucet or a late-night snack request. I wasn't expecting anyone else, so I stood up and walked over to the door. I glanced through the peephole, expecting to see Terry's familiar face, but instead I saw a figure in a dark jacket wearing a ski mask. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't Terry. The person on the other side of the door was a stranger, and something about the way he stood there, motionless, sent a cold shiver down my spine. I froze for a second, unsure of what to do. I wanted to open the door and ask him what he needed, but everything inside me screamed that something was wrong. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I realized he wasn't knocking anymore. He was just standing there waiting. The silence between us stretched longer than it should have, and I began to feel uneasy, like I was being watched. I decided not to engage. I backed away from the door slowly, reaching for my phone to call the police. But before I could even unlock it, I heard another knock, this time harder and more insistent. I could feel my pulse quickening as I glanced back at the door. I wasn't sure if it was a good idea to ignore him, but I knew I couldn't just open it. I grabbed a nearby chair and wedged it under the doorknob, hoping it would give me some time if things escalated. The knocks kept coming, each one growing louder and more desperate, until suddenly the door handle rattled. I could hear the man on the other side muttering to himself, but his words were muffled, like he was speaking through clenched teeth. A sickening feel ensued in my stomach as I realized that he wasn't just knocking anymore. He was trying to get in. I held my breath, hoping he would leave, but instead, there was a sharp crack and the door shifted slightly, like someone had tried to force it open. My heart raced. It wasn't Terry. It wasn't anyone I knew. Whoever this was, they weren't just asking for help. They were trying to break in. Panic set in, and I rushed the phone, dialing 911 with shaky fingers. The operator answered, but I couldn't speak. My throat had gone dry, and I could barely hear over the sound of the man's repeated attempts to shove the door open. I pressed myself against the wall beside the door, trying to make myself as small as possible, my breath coming in short gasps. I could feel my chest tightening, and all I wanted was for it to stop. I was about to whisper my location into the phone when I heard a violent shove. The door buckled slightly, and I felt the chair slip under the force of the impact. I had just enough time to shove it back into place before the door rattled again. The man outside wasn't giving up. The operator on the other end was still trying to reach me, but I couldn't answer. My mind was spinning, and my body was on autopilot as I grabbed a nearby lamp and held it up like a weapon. I could hear the man's grunts of frustration, his hands scraping against the wood as he tried to force the door open. I was terrified, but somehow I managed to stay quiet, staying low to the ground, hoping that he wouldn't realize how close he was to getting in. And then, just when I thought the door was going to break open entirely, there was a loud thud. The man had stopped pushing. I held my breath, not daring to make a sound. Was he leaving? Had he heard something that made him reconsider? No. The next thing I knew, I heard him say something in a low voice, something that sent a chill down my spine. "Let me in, or it'll make you regret it." I tried not to move, trying to stay as still as possible. I was paralyzed, unable to form a coherent thought as my mind raced through every possible worst-case scenario. What if he had a weapon? What if he was going to break the window and come in through there? I needed to keep him out, but I didn't know how much longer I could hold on. And then, just as I was about to lose hope, the sound of sirens pierced the night. A few seconds later, there was a knock on my door, this time from the outside, but it was different. It was the police. They must have arrived just in time. The man outside stopped moving. I could hear him hesitate, as if deciding whether to run or fight. A few seconds passed, and then I heard footsteps retreating, fading into the distance. I waited a moment longer. Then, I opened the door just a crack to find two officers standing there, their faces tense. They told me they'd seen someone matching the man's description nearby, but they hadn't caught him yet. They'd be doing a sweep of the area, but they wanted to make sure I was okay first. I could barely speak, but I nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and lingering fear. The officers stayed for a while, checking the perimeter of my home and making sure all the windows were secure. They offered to take a statement, but I just wanted to sit down and breathe. The adrenaline had drained from my body, leaving me shaking uncontrollably. I thanked them as they left, locking every door behind them before retreating into the safety of my living room. That night, I couldn't sleep. The fear still lingered in my chest, knowing it could have gone differently if I hadn't acted in time. It was a night I would never forget. One that left me constantly double-checking the locks and never feeling quite safe again. I worked a graveyard shift at a highway rest stop, a quiet and lonely job that often left me with too much time to think. The rest stop was tucked between miles of road and dense woods, far from the nearest town. Last nights, the place was empty, save for a few truckers passing through or the occasional car stopping for gas. But every night, without fail, I noticed the same car parked at the far edge of the lot. It was a nondescript sedan, gray and unremarkable, sitting in the same spot each time. I didn't think much of it at first. People passed through all the time, and it wasn't uncommon for cars to sit idle for a while before driving off. But as the days went by, I began to notice a pattern. The car would always appear just as the sun set, and it would remain there, parked and still, throughout my entire shift. Some nights it didn't even move at all. After a week of seeing it every night, I started to feel uneasy. There was something unsettling about how consistent it was. I'd glance out the window during slow moments, and sure enough, the car would be there. No one ever got in or out, just the car parked silently at the edge of the lot. One particularly quiet night, as I was wiping down the counter, I noticed the car again. It was parked as usual, but this time something was different. The headlights were off, and the car was completely still. As I watched, I saw a shadow move inside, and I realized the driver's side window was slightly rolled down. I couldn't make out any details, but I had the distinct feeling that someone was watching me. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was overthinking it. I had a tendency to be paranoid when I was alone for too long, and the isolation of the rest stop didn't help. But as the hours dragged on, I found myself glancing at the car more frequently, each time feeling like there was someone in it, waiting. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. The next night, it happened again. The car was there, parked at the edge of the lot, with no one around. This time I decided to watch more closely. As I stood by the window, my heart beating faster as I waited. After what felt like an eternity, the car's headlights flicked on briefly, then turned off again. I couldn't shake the feeling that the driver was waiting for something or someone. I tried to focus on the tasks at hand, but the car kept drawing my attention. The darkness outside seemed thicker that night. The light from the rest stop's lamps cast long shadows across the lot. I was about to head to the back room when I saw movement from the corner of my eye. The figure inside the car had shifted. The person was now facing the store, and I could swear their eyes were trained on me. I froze, my hand gripping the edge of the counter. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but my pulse raced in my ears. Something about the way the person was sitting, unmoving and so still, felt unnatural. I tried to dismiss the thought, but the unease wouldn't leave me. That night I didn't get any sleep. Every time I glanced out the window, I saw the car, parked just as before. The person inside hadn't moved. I kept telling myself it was just someone passing through, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The quiet of the night seemed to press down on me, amplifying every little sound and every shift in my gaze. The next night I was determined not to let my nerves get the better of me. I went through my shift as usual, trying to ignore the car, but by midnight my attention was once again drawn to it. I hadn't noticed it at first, But this time there was movement, clear and deliberate. A hand reached up from inside the car and adjusted the rear view mirror, then slowly lowered. My breath caught in my throat. The person in the car wasn't just waiting. They were watching me. My instinct was to grab my phone, but my hands were shaking too badly. I was about to call someone when I noticed something even more unsettling. The man in the car was now holding a camera. I could barely breathe as I watched him raise it, the lens pointed directly at me. I could see the flash of the camera reflecting off the window as he snapped a picture. My stomach dropped. My thoughts raced. I was being photographed. He was taking pictures of me through the store window. I quickly ducked down, trying to hide behind the counter. My mind was spinning. Why would anyone do that? What did he want from me? I tried to keep my voice steady as I grabbed the phone, but my fingers fumbled as I dialed the local police. The line rang, and all I could hear was my frantic breathing. When the dispatcher answered, I could barely get the words out. Someone's outside. They've been taking pictures of me. I don't know why, but I feel like they're watching me. Please, you need to send someone. The dispatcher promised to send someone immediately, and the seconds felt like hours. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay hidden behind the counter all night, and I couldn't let him know I'd seen him. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to calm myself, but I kept glancing at the window, terrified I'd know I was watching him too. Minutes passed, and finally I saw the flashing lights of a police car pull into the lot. The man in the sedan didn't move. He was still parked, still staring at the store. The officers stepped out of the car and approached, their eyes scanning the lot. The moment they walked past the window, I felt a mix of relief and fear. I wasn't alone anymore, but the man hadn't moved. When the officers approached the sedan, the man finally drove off, his tires screeching as he sped away. The police chased him for a few miles before losing him in the dark. I never saw the car again, but the image of him taking pictures of me stayed with me. The rest of my shift passed in a haze. I kept checking the windows, half expecting him to return. I didn't know who he was or what he wanted, but I would never forget the feeling of being watched. And though the police never found him, I never worked a night shift at that rest stop again. The thought of that car, parked quietly at the edge of the lot, watching me through the dark, was too much to bear. I had been preparing for weeks for this job interview, researching the company, practicing my answers, and picking out the perfect outfit. The company had posted the job opening on a professional network, and the interview was set in an office building I hadn't heard of before. It seemed promising at first. The job description aligned with my skills, and everything about it seemed like a step up in my career. When I arrived at the building, it looked typical, tall, sleek, with glass windows reflecting the busy city streets below. I walked into the lobby, greeted by the receptionist, who gave me a visitor badge and directed me to the elevator. The building was old, with creaky floors and a faint smell of dust in the air. The elevator itself seemed out of place, almost too modern compared to the rest of the building, with sleek buttons and a polished interior. I pressed the button for the 14th floor, where the interview was supposed to take place. As the doors closed and the elevator started its ascent, I felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. I checked my phone, double-checked the email for the interview details, and ran over my notes one last time. The elevator moved smoothly at first, but as I glanced up, I noticed the lights flicker briefly. I thought nothing of it. These things happened in older buildings. The elevator seemed to stop after what felt like an eternity. I assumed we had reached the 14th floor, but when I looked at the display, it was stuck between floors. The usual soft hum of the elevator motors stopped abruptly, replaced by a dull silence. For a moment, I thought maybe there was just a delay, but the silence stretched on unnervingly long. I pressed the emergency button, but it didn't seem to work. I tried calling the receptionist, but my phone had no signal. A knot tightened in my stomach as I realized how isolated I was. No one else had entered the elevator, and there were no voices, no footsteps, no signs of life anywhere. I pressed the floor button again, but nothing happened. I stared at the digital display, hoping it would shift back to the 14th floor, but the numbers just blinked steadily, stuck between two floors. It was then that I noticed the lights in the elevator were dimming. I reached for the panel to adjust the brightness, but the dimming continued until only the faintest glow from the emergency light illuminated the cabin. My heart started to race as I realized how strange the situation was. The air inside the elevator felt heavy, as if the oxygen had been drained, and I suddenly became aware of how cramped and small the space had become. This dragged on as I looked desperately at the closed elevator doors. The thought that I might be stuck in here for hours started to set in. But the worst part was that I couldn't shake the eerie sensation creeping over me. It felt wrong. Like the elevator wasn't supposed to be here. Or maybe it wasn't supposed to go where it was going. I pressed the emergency button again. But this time there was no mechanical sound. No voice. Nothing. The silence was suffocating, but then, just as I was about to hit the emergency button again, the door suddenly opened. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I wasn't on the 14th floor as I expected. Instead, I stood in a dark hallway. The hallway was unnervingly empty, stretching far beyond what should have been the normal office floor. There were no lights, only a dull, sickly glow coming from the end of the corridor. The floor was covered with worn-out carpeting, and the walls were a dull beige color with no signs of life. I stepped out cautiously, my heart pounding. I called out, but my voice echoed in the empty space. It was as if the entire floor had been abandoned. There were no offices, no cubicles, no people. The silence was eerie, seeming to press in from all sides. I tried to call out again, but the silence swallowed my voice whole. The hallway stretched ahead with no signs of doors or windows, no exit signs and no markings indicating where I was. I walked forward, feeling increasingly disoriented, as though the floor itself didn't belong to the building I had entered. The air grew colder with each step I took, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My thoughts raced, and I considered turning back, but the elevator had disappeared when I looked. The doors had vanished, leaving behind only a dark and empty corridor. I started walking faster, my footsteps echoing through the hallway. There were no sounds of anyone else, no voices, no movement. I had no idea where I was or how to get out. As I walked deeper into the corridor, I noticed doors along the walls, but they were all shut tight with no labels and no windows. It felt like a maze, and the more I walked, the more it felt like I was walking in circles. After what felt like an hour, I reached the end of the hall. There was a door on the left, and it looked slightly ajar. I hesitated before pushing it open, half expecting it to be locked, but it creaked open easily. Inside, I found a small, dimly lit office. It was dusty, untouched, like no one had worked here for years. Old files and papers were scattered across the desk, some of them yellowed with age. On the far wall, a large clock ticked slowly, but there was no sound of anyone moving or talking. I stepped further into the room, my fingers brushing the papers on the desk. There was a sense of wrongness in the air, as if this office wasn't supposed to exist at all. That's when I heard a soft thump, followed by faint whispering. I turned quickly, but the room was empty, the air heavy with an unsettling stillness. Panicking, I backed out of the room and ran toward the hallway, hoping to find a way out. But no matter how many steps I took, it felt like the hallway stretched on forever. I turned corners that weren't there before, and the floor beneath my feet seemed to shift with every step I took. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find the elevator again. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I found the stairs. I ran down 3 flights of stairs, breathless and shaking, until I reached the ground floor. I pushed open the door, only to be greeted by the familiar lobby. It looked completely normal, like nothing had happened at all. I walked quickly to the exit, my legs shaky, my mind still reeling from what I had just experienced. As I stepped out into daylight, I glanced back at the building, wondering if it was all just a strange dream. But the fear still lingered. Whatever had happened in that building, I knew one thing for sure. I would never step foot inside again. I was at the gym, finishing up my usual workout. It was just after 6 in the evening, and the place was bustling with people trying to get in their evening sets. The clanging of weights and a hum of cardio machines were the background music to the routine I had memorized. I was in the free weight area, adjusting the barbell for my next set of squats when a man approached me. "Do you need a spot?" he asked, his voice friendly but with a hint of something I couldn't hint. He was average height, wearing a plain black shirt and gym shorts. His face seemed familiar, but I couldn't pinpoint why. I hadn't seen him at the gym before, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I nodded, grateful for the help since the weights were heavier than usual. He moved into position behind me, and I started my set. The man was quiet, but I could feel his eyes on me. It wasn't just the typical spotting gaze. There was something unsettling about it. He seemed to focus too intensely, like he was watching for something more than just whether or not I needed help with the lift. but I brushed off the feeling. Maybe he was just a serious gym goer and I was overthinking it. When I finished, I thanked him and moved to the next station. He stayed close by, not in a pushy way, but in a way that felt like he was lingering just a little too much. He didn't seem like the type to engage in small talk, but he kept glancing over at me between his own sets. Every time I caught his eye, he'd smile. But it wasn't a comforting smile. It was almost too knowing, like he was trying to make a connection I wasn't ready for. I tried to ignore him, telling myself I was being paranoid. Gym-goers didn't always follow normal social cues, and maybe he was just one of those types who liked to be around people. As I worked through my sets, I couldn't shake the sense that he was always a little too close, always a little too observant. I finished my workout about 40 minutes later, wiped the sweat from my face, and decided to hit the locker room. As I passed by the row of machines, I caught sight of him again, still working out, but watching me. The feeling of being watched crept up my spine.
I told myself I was being ridiculous. There were dozens of other people around, and I was just another face in the crowd.
But when I ducked into the locker room, I couldn't shake the thought that he was still on my heels. The locker room was mostly empty. I put my things in a locker and started changing. It was quiet except for the faint sound of the gym's music leaking through the walls. But then I heard footsteps. They were light but steady, and they came from the direction of the door. My heart skipped a beat and I looked over my shoulder. For a split second, I thought I saw a shadow pass by the crack in the locker room door, but I couldn't be sure. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably just someone else heading to the showers. But then I heard the door creak open, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps again. This time they stopped just outside the locker room. I froze, my stomach wasn't tightening. I wasn't sure what made me feel more uneasy. The fact that someone was lingering outside, or the fact that I recognized the footsteps as being too familiar. I finished changing as quickly as I could, hoping to get out of there before whoever was waiting could make their presence known. As I headed toward the door, I peered through the gap. My stomach dropped when I saw him standing just outside, looking down at his phone. He wasn't doing anything overtly threatening, but the fact that he was there, right outside, made me feel like I was being cornered. I kept my head down and walked briskly past him, avoiding eye contact. I hoped if I ignored him, maybe he would let it go. But as I exited the locker room, I saw him standing by the exit doors, his arms crossed over his chest. He smiled at me as I approached and my heart raced. "Are you leaving already?" he asked casually, like we were just two people having a normal conversation after a workout. "I thought you'd be here longer." I forced a smile, my voice coming out a little too fast. "Yeah, long day. Gotta get going." He didn't seem to care. He just nodded. But something about the way his eyes lingered on me felt different now. It wasn't the same casual glance. There was an intensity there, like he was analyzing me, weighing his next move. I walked out of the building as quickly as I could, my nerves on edge. The parking lot was fairly empty, and I was the only one walking toward my car. As I got closer to my vehicle, I looked over my shoulder. The man was standing by the gym doors, watching me again. My skin crawled as I unlocked my car and climbed inside. I slammed the door shut, but I didn't immediately start the engine. I kept an eye on him through my rearview mirror. He didn't move for several minutes, and I wondered if he was just standing there waiting for me to leave. I finally started the car and backed out, but as I did, I saw him step out of the building and walk toward the parking lot. He wasn't rushing, just taking his time, his pace matching mine. I drove around the block, trying to lose him, but when I turned onto the main street, I saw him again. He was walking down the sidewalk, right on the edge of the road, like he was following my every move. I tightened my grip on the wheel, the unease growing with every block. I knew he was following me now. I didn't know why, but I knew. I took a sharp left into a different part of town, trying to get rid of him. But he stayed behind me, never speeding up or slowing down. For an hour, I drove around, making unnecessary turns and doubling back on myself. He kept pace, never getting too close, but never falling behind. I eventually ended up at a stoplight near my apartment complex. I glanced in my rearview mirror, and for the first time since I'd seen him, he wasn't there. The street was empty. I breathed a sigh of relief, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me for hours afterward. The next day I didn't see him at the gym, and I haven't seen him since. But every time I pull into the parking lot now, I check the surroundings, just in case. I can't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, he's still watching. It was late one evening when I decided to take a detour on my usual route home. I was coming back from a long day of work, feeling the exhaustion settle into my bones. I'd seen the hitchhiker standing at the side of the road a few miles back, but initially I'd passed him by. Thinking about his appearance made me hesitate. He was tall, dressed in a worn leather jacket, with shaggy dark hair and a stare that seemed to go right through you. But after a couple of miles, I started thinking about how long he must have been standing there. It wasn't exactly common to see someone out here this far from the nearest town, so I turned the car around. When I pulled up beside him, he didn't hesitate. He just opened the door and climbed in without a word. His eyes met mine briefly, but he didn't say anything right away. I wasn't nervous at first. I'd picked up hitchhikers before, and I figured I could handle myself if anything went wrong. Still, there was something unsettling about the silence that hung between us. We drove in silence for the first few miles, the only sound being the hum of the engine and the soft clicking of the turn signal. I tried to gauge him, but he sat still, staring out the window, his face shadowed by the fading light of the day. He didn't look dangerous, but there was something odd about the way he held himself too still, almost as if he were waiting for something. I glanced at him again, but he didn't seem to notice. His eyes were fixed on something out the window, lost in thought. Then, about halfway through the drive, he spoke. His voice was calm, almost too calm, as if the words had been rehearsed 1,000 times in his head. "Do you ever wonder," he said, "if anyone would find you, if you went missing, or if you just disappeared one day, how long it would take before someone even noticed?" I blinked, not sure I'd heard him correctly. His question hung in the air like a fog, making my skin prickle. I tried to laugh it off, but it came out forced. "What do you mean exactly?" I asked, trying to keep the tone light, though I couldn't shake the strange feeling crawling up my spine. He didn't turn to look at me. His gaze remained fixed on the darkening landscape outside the window. "I mean, if he just vanished," he said, his voice lowering slightly. "How long would it take for someone to realize? A day? A week? A month? And who would even care?" I could feel my grip tightening on the steering wheel, a subtle tension rising in my chest. The question was off-putting and unsettling. I tried to focus on the road ahead, the darkened highway stretching out before us, but his words lingered in my mind. There was something eerie about the way he asked. It felt like he was speaking from experience, as if he thought about it too much. I wasn't sure how to respond. 1,000 different answers ran through my head, but none of them seemed to make sense. I glanced over at him, trying to gauge his face, but he had that same distant expression, like he wasn't really there. My instinct kicked in, and I did what any cop would do in a situation like this. I shifted the conversation, trying to take control. "I'm actually a cop," I said casually, trying to make my voice sound as nonchalant as possible. "I don't worry too much about stuff like that." For a moment he was silent. I could feel his eyes on me, but I didn't dare look back. The atmosphere in the car seemed to shift, becoming colder and more tense. The air felt thick and heavy, as if something had changed in that split second. I could sense his eyes studying me, measuring me somehow. After a few moments he spoke again, this time with a faint smirk in his voice. "Oh, that's convenient," he said. "A cop, huh? Well, I suppose that means you'd be the one investigating your own disappearance then, wouldn't you?" His words hit me like a cold wave. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and the sense of dread creeping over me. The casual way he said it made my skin crawl. I forced myself to keep my hands steady on the wheel, though my thoughts were racing. I glanced at him, and this time I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was terribly wrong. His eyes met mine, and for the first time I saw a glimmer of something dark, something that sent a shiver down my spine. The smile that played at the corners of his lips was small, but it was there, like a secret he wasn't willing to share. I could feel his gaze linger on me, studying my every move. I didn't want to provoke him. I didn't want to escalate things. I kept my voice steady, but my heart was pounding in my chest. "I don't think you have to worry about that," I said, trying to sound confident. "In just giving you a ride. Nothing to be afraid of." But he didn't seem convinced. He was staring at me now, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though he was sizing me up. "You're probably right," he said, his voice taking on a different tone, one that sounded almost amused. "But you never know. Things don't always go as planned." I was starting to get the sense that I wasn't dealing with someone who was entirely mentally stable. The air in the car, felt heavy, like it was pressing in on me, suffocating me. My mind was racing, weighing the options, trying to decide whether to keep driving or stop the car and kick him out right then and there. We were approaching a small town, and I slowed down as we neared the next stop. I had no idea where I was or what town it was, but the thought of continuing this drive with him was becoming unbearable. As I pulled over to the side of the road, I glanced at him, my voice strained but polite. "All right, this is your stop," I said firmly, hoping he'd take the hint. Without a word, he opened the door and stepped out. He didn't even glance back as he closed the door behind him, his figure disappearing into the darkness. I sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the wheel, my breath coming in shallow bursts. I didn't realize just how much tension had left my body until I finally let out a long breath. The air in the car felt lighter, less oppressive. I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting him to be following me, but there was nothing, only the empty stretch of road behind me. I drove away slowly, still shaken, my thoughts swirling. The encounter left a lingering unease in my stomach, the sense that I just narrowly avoided something I couldn't quite put into words. I was at work when it happened. It was an ordinary Tuesday, and I was sitting at my desk, typing away, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw an alert from my home security app. Front door opened. I froze. I hadn't touched the door all morning. My heart rate quickened as I checked the time. It was well past the hours when I usually get home. I opened the app on my phone to check the live feed from the security camera I had installed at the front door. The camera feed showed nothing but an empty porch. The door was wide open though. The stillness of it all made my mind race with questions I didn't have answers to. I tried calling my neighbor, hoping maybe they had seen something, but there was no answer. I dialed the police and explained the situation. I told them that I wasn't home, but my front door had been opened. They asked me if I could make it home right away, and I told them I would, but I didn't feel safe going alone. The dispatcher assured me that an officer would be sent to my location while I made my way back. My mind was spinning as I left work, my thoughts racing with 100 different scenarios. Who could have been in my house? Why would someone open my door while I wasn't there? My pulse thudded in my ears, and I gripped the steering wheel tightly as I drove home. When I pulled up to my house, I saw the police cruiser parked out front. The officer was standing in my front yard, looking around as if trying to make sense of the scene. He waved at me as I approached, and I quickly got out of the car. "You should stay outside for now," the officer said. His voice was calm, but I could tell he was on alert. "We've got someone inside already taking a look." I stepped back, leaning against the side of my car, and waited. The air felt heavy, as if everything was holding its breath. A few moments later, another officer came out through the back door. He approached me, his expression grim. "Mom," he said, his voice low. "We need to talk." He didn't mince words. "The back door has been broken open. It looks like someone forced their way in." I felt my stomach drop. Broken. My mind struggled to comprehend what I was hearing. "What do you mean, broken? How could someone get inside?" I stammered. "We're still trying to piece things together," he said. "But it looks like they used a crowbar or something similar to break the lock. There are muddy footprints leading from the back door into your house, all through the hallway and into the living room. They were wearing shoes that left a distinct pattern." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. It's possible they were inside for a while before they left. I couldn't speak for a moment, the panic swirling inside me, turning my stomach into a tight knot. They had been in my house. Someone had come in, walked around, and left without taking anything. At least, that's what they told me at first. But what did they want? What had they been looking for? I suddenly felt as if everything I thought I knew about my safe space had been shattered. The officer led me inside, cautioning me to be careful. I stepped over the threshold, my heart hammering in my chest. The house looked mostly untouched, but something felt off. There was a sense of unease in the air. The quiet felt too heavy. As I walked through the house with the officer, I noticed the trail of muddy prints leading down the hallway. They were faint but unmistakable. It didn't seem like the person had been trying to hide their presence. The officer inspected the broken door frame, which was splintered around the lock. "This is where they got in," he muttered. I nodded, barely able to focus on what he was saying. He crouched down to examine the mud on the floor, brushing his fingers through it. "Looks like they didn't come through the front, but made their way around back. No signs of forced entry through the windows, but it's clear they knew how to get inside." I was trying to process everything, but the questions kept flooding my mind. Had they been watching me? Did they know I wasn't home? Were they looking for something specific? The house wasn't particularly large, and nothing seemed out of place, but the sense of violation was overwhelming. My own home had been breached. We continued through the house, and I noticed something else. My bedroom door was slightly ajar. I hadn't left it that way. The officer also seemed to notice this. He opened it carefully, scanning the room. Nothing appeared disturbed here. He said, though I could tell he was still searching for any signs of forced entry or evidence that might indicate what had happened. But I didn't feel reassured. "Do you think they took anything?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "We don't think so, but it's hard to say just yet," he replied. "We'll need to do a thorough check once we've secured this scene and collected evidence. The footprints in the broken door suggest they didn't expect to be seen or caught. They might have been searching for something, but they didn't seem to take anything with them." As the officers continued their investigation, I stood there, my mind reeling. I couldn't stop thinking about the alert from my security app. Why had it gone off? Why had my front door been opened? The app should have notified me the moment anyone entered, but it didn't. I looked at the officer who was making notes in his notepad. "Is there any way to know when the door was opened? Can you track that through the cameras?" I asked. The officer shook his head. "Unfortunately, we can't track that from here. The cameras are linked to your security system, but there's a delay in the alert sometimes. If someone knew how to disable your system or block it somehow, they could have gotten in without triggering the alarm." I felt a chill run down my spine. I'd never thought about someone tampering with my security system. The thought that someone had known how to bypass it made me feel even more vulnerable. It was as if they were one step ahead, the whole time. Later that evening, after the police had finished their investigation, I went to bed with the unsettling knowledge that someone had been inside my house. They touched my things, walked through my rooms, and left without a trace. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that I wasn't as safe in my own home as I had once believed. The house felt different now, cold, unwelcoming, and empty. In the weeks that followed, the police kept in touch, but they had no new leads. No fingerprints, no signs of forced entry, other than the back door. The muddy footprints had disappeared with the rain. I changed all the locks and added more security measures, but nothing made me feel the same. I had never looked at my home the same way again, always feeling as though something or someone was just a little too close for comfort. I had always enjoyed taking night classes at college. The campus was quieter in the evenings, and there was something about the atmosphere that made it easier to focus. I'd usually park in the lot behind the main building, where there were fewer cars, and I liked the solitude it provided. It wasn't until that particular evening that I began to regret my choice of parking spot. I finished my class around 10:30 p.m. and made my way to the back lot, tired from a long day of lectures and work. The campus was nearly empty, the lights casting long shadows across the pavement. I was used to the quiet, but tonight there was something unsettling about it. I didn't think much of it at first, focusing on the fact that I had a long drive ahead of me. When I reached my car, I saw the problem immediately. The front tire was completely flat. The sidewall slashed clean through. I stood frozen for a moment, my heart sinking. It wasn't just a random puncture. It was deliberate. The metal rim of the wheel gleamed in the dim light as if mocking me, and I could already feel the anxiety creeping in. Who would do this? I looked around the lot, hoping to spot someone, but the place was deserted. The streetlights flickered as I pulled out my phone, about to call for a tow. That's when I heard footsteps, soft and deliberate, that seemed to be getting closer. I turned my head to see a man emerging from the shadows near the edge of the parking lot. At first, I thought he might be another student or maybe someone else stranded, but as he drew closer, I realized he wasn't dressed like any student I'd ever seen. His clothes were dark and unremarkable, but his posture was stiff and almost too perfect, like he was trying too hard to look casual. He wasn't smiling, and his face was partially obscured by a hood, but there was something in the way he moved that immediately set off warning bells in my head. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice soft but firm, like he was already assuming the role of the helpful stranger. I stepped back instinctively, my eyes scanning the area for anyone who might hear. There was no one around. I shook my head. "I've got it covered, thanks." He didn't move. Instead, he stepped a little closer, still watching me with an intensity that made me uneasy. "You know," he continued, "your tire didn't just get slashed by accident. Someone's been watching you." His words hung in the air, heavy with uncertainty. I froze, not knowing how to respond. Who was this guy? I don't need any help, I managed, trying to sound confident. In calling a tow truck.
He'll be fine.
The man didn't look bothered by my rejection. In fact, he seemed almost pleased, like he expected me to say that. His lips curled slightly, faintly unreadable expression. He took another step toward me, and I felt a chill run through me. My phone felt too far away in my hand, and my mind raced through every scenario I could think of to get out of there. "I've been watching you for weeks," he said, almost casually, like it was nothing. "I've seen you come here every night. Same parking spot, same routine. It's kind of interesting, don't you think?" My blood ran cold. I didn't respond, my eyes darting around for any sign of someone nearby.
Nothing.
It was just me and this man in the middle of a dark parking lot. I was beginning to realize that this wasn't just a strange coincidence. This guy knew things about me. Details I hadn't even realized were visible. "I don't know who you are," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "But I don't want anything to do with you." His gaze softened, but it wasn't comforting. It was like he was amused by my resistance, like he found it all to be some sort of game. He smiled faintly, and I noticed how wide his eyes were, too wide, almost unblinking. "I can help you," he said, his voice turning quieter, coaxing. "It's not safe to be here alone. Not with your tire like this. You never know who might come by." I took a step back, my heart pounding. Every instinct told me to run, but I didn't know which direction would be safe. I looked at the tire again, realizing the damage was too much for me to handle on my own. But I wasn't about to get into a car with this man. Not after everything he'd said. His presence felt suffocating, like the air around us had thickened. "Fine," I repeated, more forcefully this time. In calling someone, his smile faded, and his eyes narrowed just slightly. There was no mistaking the shift in his demeanor. He didn't look at me like someone who was trying to help anymore. He looked at me like he was deciding whether to get angry or not. I quickly dialed the number for the tow truck, my hands trembling as I hit send. The man stood still, watching me intently. The seconds felt like hours. I wasn't sure what he would do next. Would he leave? Would he make things worse? "Why don't you just let me give you a ride?" he said, taking another step forward. His voice had lost its pleasant tone, replaced with something darker and more insistent. "It's a long walk home." I shook my head, feeling a wave of panic wash over me. The tow truck was on its way, but I wasn't sure I could wait that long with this man standing so close. I took another step back, my hand clutching my phone like a lifeline. "I don't know you," I said again, this time with more conviction. "You need to leave." He paused for a moment, his eyes flicking to my phone. He seemed to consider something. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the shadows from which he had emerged. I didn't waste a second. I immediately moved to the front of my car, locking myself inside. The tow truck arrived just a few minutes later, and I didn't even wait for them to hook up my car before I got in and drove away. My hands were still shaking when I finally reached home, and I double-checked the locks before settling down. I never saw that man again. At every night class after that, I took extra care to park in a well-lit spot, hoping I wouldn't run into anyone like him again. It started out innocently enough. I came into work one Monday morning to find a bouquet of bright yellow daisies on my desk. No card, no note, just the flowers sitting there like a simple gesture of kindness. I smiled at the thought of a secret admirer or maybe a colleague who just wanted to brighten my day. The flowers were beautiful, and I thought little more of it. The next day there was another bouquet. This time, white lilies, their petals wide and delicate, their scent overwhelming. Again, no note. I had received flowers before from friends and family, but this was different. These bouquets came every day, and there was never any indication of who was sending them. At first it felt flattering that someone cared enough to send flowers without wanting anything in return. But as the days went on, something about it began to unsettle me. I started noticing little things. On the third day there were red roses, long-stemmed and perfect, arranged meticulously in a vase. The following morning, a bouquet of orchids sat on my desk, their colors almost too vibrant. The flowers were always fresh, always beautiful, and always delivered before I arrived. Whoever was sending them was paying attention to my schedule. I tried to convince myself it was harmless. I told myself it could be anyone, someone I worked with, a friend of a friend, or maybe even a long-forgotten acquaintance trying to rekindle some old connection. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to feel the weight of the mystery hanging over me. Who was doing this? And what? I started to feel like I was being watched. Then, one morning, everything changed. I was going through the bouquet as usual, arranging the flowers in a vase when something caught my eye. At the bottom of the stems, hidden under the leaves, was a small folded piece of paper. My heart skipped a beat as I pulled it out. The paper was old, slightly crumpled, and when I unfolded it I realized it wasn't a note or message, it was a photograph. I stared at the photo for a long time. It was a picture of me, taken from the street, just outside my apartment building. It was a candid shot, the kind someone would take when they thought you weren't looking. The photo was clear, my face was visible, and I could even make out the reflection of my apartment's front door in the background. My stomach twisted. How had someone gotten this picture? I didn't tell anyone. At first I thought I was overreacting. Maybe it was just a coincidence, some prank, or an elaborate misunderstanding. I tried to forget about it and went back to my day. But the seed of unease had been planted. The next day, I found another bouquet on my desk, and beneath the flowers, there was another photograph. This one was taken from a different angle, but it was still me, standing at the bus stop outside my apartment. This time I couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. The flowers kept coming, each day a new bouquet, and each day a new photograph. They weren't always of me from the same angle, but they were always taken near my apartment building, sometimes in the early morning, when I left for work, other times late at night when I was coming home. The photos were becoming more frequent and the angles more unsettling. They weren't just of me walking down the street anymore. Now, they were close-ups, me unlocking my front door, me sitting in my living room window. Whoever was sending them was getting closer, and it felt like I was being watched every single moment. I started to feel paranoid. I would check my apartment before I went to bed, double-check the locks, look out the window to see if anyone was standing on the street below. I began to wonder if I was being followed, if someone knew where I lived, knew my routine, knew everything about me. The thought of someone watching me from the shadows made my skin crawl. A few days later, I found something different in the bouquet. This time it wasn't a photo, but a small envelope sealed shut. My hand shook as I opened it. Inside was a single sentence, handwritten in neat, almost elegant script. "I've been waiting for you to notice me." My heart stopped. The words felt like a threat, like a declaration. It was no longer about the flowers. Whoever was sending them wasn't just admiring me from afar. They were obsessed with me. I didn't know what to do. That evening I called a friend, but I didn't want to admit how scared I was. She suggested I go to the police, but I hesitated. The flowers had never been directly threatening, and the photos could have been taken from public spaces. How could I explain this without sounding paranoid or crazy? I didn't have solid proof that anyone had broken any laws, but the fear kept growing. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was sending these was getting closer, watching me more closely. I started to feel trapped in my own apartment. I changed my routine, started taking different routes to work, and took extra precautions when I went out. But, no matter what I did, the flowers kept coming, every day without fail. They were always different, always fresh, always beautiful, and every day there was a new photo tucked inside, a new glimpse of me, a new reminder that someone was watching. The police eventually got involved, but they couldn't do much. The flowers were legal, the photos were taken in public spaces, and there was no clear threat, no direct danger. But they agreed to help me. They set up surveillance around my apartment building, monitored the delivery services I used, and even looked into my workplace, wondering if anyone there had access to my schedule. A few weeks later, the flowers stopped coming. The bouquet ceased, and the photos disappeared. For a while, I thought maybe it was over, that the person had lost interest or been scared off. But even now, months later, every time I hear the sound of someone outside my window, or when I find a single flower on my doorstep, I wonder if they've been watching me all along, waiting for the perfect moment to step out of the shadows again. I had just settled in for a quiet evening at home, curled up on the couch with a book. The house was empty, the way I liked it. My roommate had gone out with friends, and my parents were away for the weekend. It was the perfect chance to relax, away from the usual noise and distractions. The sound of the doorbell ringing shattered the calm. It was abrupt, unnervingly loud in the stillness of the house. I glanced at the clock. Who would be at the door at this hour? I wasn't expecting anyone, and no one had made plans to stop by. I got up, walked over to the door, and peered through the peephole. The porch was empty. Nothing. No car in the driveway. No footsteps. Not even a shadow. Just the faint glow of the porch light casting long, still shadows on the ground. Confused, I pulled back from the door. I didn't know what to make of it. Maybe it was some kids playing a prank, though I couldn't remember the last time someone rang my doorbell just to run off. I stood there for a second, debating whether to check outside. Before I could make up my mind, the doorbell rang again, this time more rapidly, like someone is pressing the button over and over. My pulse quickened. There was no way it was the same person from before. They would have had to be standing right outside the door, waiting for me to look. I stepped back from the door, my heart thudding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Should I call someone? Maybe it was nothing, just a prank. But then something strange happened. I heard a faint scuffling sound from the other side of the door. I hesitated, then slowly crept toward the peephole again. This time there was something different. On the welcome mat, just in front of the door, was a small black object. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. It looked like a phone, a burner phone. My mind raced. Why would someone leave a phone on my mat? I stepped back, but my curiosity got the best of me. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but I had to know. So I opened the door just enough to peek outside. The phone was there, sitting in the exact spot I had seen it through the peephole. No one was around, no sounds, just silence. I grabbed the phone, carefully avoiding touching anything else, and pulled it inside. As soon as the door closed behind me, I locked it without thinking. Holding the burner phone, I stared at it for a moment, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. It felt wrong, unnatural. My instincts were telling me to call the police, but I hesitated. What would I even say? Just as I was about to set the phone down, it rang. I froze, my fingers still hovering over the screen. The ringtone was a simple, generic melody, but it felt ominous in the quiet of my living room. My first instinct was to ignore it, but I couldn't help myself. I answered the call, holding the phone to my ear, though I wasn't sure why. At first, there was nothing but silence, no breathing, no noise. I waited for a few seconds, feeling my heartbeat in my throat. Then I was about to hang up, when a voice crackled through the phone. "I see you." The voice was low and calm, the words carrying an eerie weight. My blood ran cold. It was unmistakably a man's voice, but it wasn't familiar. I wanted to slam the phone down to end the call and forget this ever happened, but something made me stay still, like I was frozen in place, and not going anywhere. "You can run from this," the voice continued, its tone unsettlingly smooth. "You've already done enough to make things interesting." I felt like my brain had stopped working. I couldn't move, couldn't think straight. What did he mean? What had I done to make things interesting? I felt sick, like I was sinking into something dark and terrifying. The voice suddenly grew louder, more insistent. "Don't try to hide. He'll always be watching." I snapped out of my paralysis. My first real thought was to hang up and call the police, but the voice stopped me again, this time more urgently. "If you call them, it'll only make things worse." The line went dead. I stood there, holding the phone, unable to move. I could still feel the weight of the voice in the room, like it was hanging over me, watching me. I glanced around the room, half expecting to see someone standing in the corner, waiting for me to react. But of course, the house was still empty. I threw the burner phone on the couch, like it might explode or turn into something worse. My hands were trembling. My mind was racing, trying to process everything that had just happened. I had no idea who had called or why. And that strange, cryptic message, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something far more dangerous than a prank. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police, my voice shaking as I explained what had happened. The operator listened patiently, but I could hear the skepticism in her voice. "It sounds like someone is messing with you," she said. "Well, send someone to check on the area. Please hurry," I begged. "I don't know what's going on, but this feels like something bad." I could feel my throat tighten as I spoke. She reassured me that officers would be on their way soon. I stayed on the couch, glancing at the front door, the burner phone now lying silently in the corner of my living room. Each minute felt like an eternity, and with each passing second, I grew more and more paranoid. The feeling of being watched never left. I kept expecting the doorbell to ring again, or worse, for someone to knock. Finally, after what seemed like an hour, there was a knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up slowly, moving toward the door with caution. I checked through the peephole. No one was there. And then I was standing at the subway platform, watching the train's arrival time flicker on the sign above. It was late, just past midnight, and the station was nearly empty, except for a few scattered commuters. The usual hum of the underground was more oppressive at this hour, the walls vibrating with the distant sound of approaching trains. The air was thick with the scent of concrete and stale air. I was exhausted from the long day and just wanted to get home. I had been waiting for a few minutes when someone approached from behind. I didn't think much of it at first. It was a public place after all. But as the man stopped directly behind me, I began to feel an uncomfortable prickle at the back of my neck. His presence was too close for a crowded train station, where people typically try to maintain their personal space. It wasn't just proximity. It was the weight of the silence between us, the way he wasn't moving at all. The hair on my arm stood up as I instinctively shifted a little to the left, giving myself a few more inches of space. When I moved, he moved with me. There was no hesitation in his step. It was almost synchronized, like he was mirroring my movements. I took another small step to the left, trying to create some distance between us, but his shadow followed me. My heart rate quickened, and the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I glanced over my shoulder, trying to get a glimpse of his face. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie that obscured most of his features, but his eyes were fixed ahead, as if he hadn't noticed my attempt to distance myself. The subway arrived with a screech, and the doors opened to reveal only a few people inside. I stepped forward, thinking it would be easier to ignore the man if I got on the train. I didn't even glance at him again, but I could still feel his presence right behind me. As I entered the train car, I quickly found an empty seat, hoping to avoid any further interaction. But the man didn't get on the train. Instead, he stepped to the side, watching me from the platform. I sighed in relief as the doors closed and the train started moving, putting more distance between us. But even as the subway pulled away from the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept looking out the window, half expecting to see him standing at the platform, watching the train depart, but he was nowhere to be seen. I told myself I was being paranoid, that he had simply been in a rush, but the unsettling feeling remained. A few stops later, the train slowed to a stop at another station. The doors opened, and a handful of passengers stepped inside. I kept my eyes down, not wanting to engage with anyone. But as I glanced up, I saw him. He had entered the car and was standing toward the back. His dark hoodie, the same one from earlier, seemed to blend into the shadows of the car, but I could feel his eyes on me. He was staring at me from across the aisle, unmoving, like he was waiting for something. I didn't know what to do. There was no one else close enough to talk to, and I didn't want to make a scene. I looked down at my phone, pretending to be absorbed in my screen, but my mind was racing. I could feel his eyes burning into me. It wasn't just discomfort anymore. It was a sense of dread creeping up my spine, taking over the calm facade I was desperately trying to maintain. The train rattled on, and the next few minutes felt like hours. When the doors opened again, I stood up and walked toward the exit, trying to keep my movements casual. I didn't want to rush or make it obvious that I was trying to get away from him, but I was so focused on the door that I didn't notice the man following behind me. He was so close that I could feel his breath on my neck. I didn't dare turn around. The train was about to stop at my station, and I had no idea what I would do if he followed me off the train. I walked faster, but when the doors opened, I stepped out onto the platform and felt a wave of relief wash over me. For a brief moment, I thought I might be safe, but then I heard footsteps behind me, steady and measured. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled again. I didn't want to look over my shoulder, but I had to. As I turned my head slightly, I saw his dark hoodie and his tall, looming figure just a few feet behind me. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't even trying to catch up. He was just walking at the same pace, mirroring my steps, staying too close as if he knew exactly where I was going. My heart pounded in my chest as I quickened my pace, walking faster toward the exit. The platform was almost empty now, with only a few people milling around, lost in their own world. I reached the stairs leading up to the street and glanced back again. He was still behind me. I wasn't sure if he was following me, or if he had just been on the same train, but the feeling of being hunted was impossible to ignore. As I reached the top of the stairs, I quickly pulled out my phone and texted a friend to let them know what was happening. I wasn't sure why I was telling them. Maybe I thought it would help to have someone know where I was. I walked as quickly as I could without looking too obvious, trying to act normal, while my mind raced with fear. When I reached the exit, I paused for a moment, trying to figure out what to do next. My eyes darted over to the street. But as I turned back toward the subway entrance, I saw something that made my stomach drop. His backpack, the one he had been carrying earlier, was hanging alongside it. I could see a flash of something sticking out of its zip ties and duct tape. My blood ran cold. It was unmistakable. I turned and fled, rushing out onto the street. My heart was pounding so hard that I thought it might burst. I didn't dare look behind me, but I didn't need to. I could feel the presence of his stare, even without seeing him. I made it to the safety of a nearby cafe, and only then did I stop to catch my breath. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him following me again. But I never saw him again. The next few days felt like a blur, and I couldn't shake the image of the zip ties and duct tape poking out of his bag. I didn't take the subway alone after that. I never found out who he was or what he wanted, but I couldn't forget how close I had come to something I couldn't even comprehend. I met Chris on a dating app, the kind where you swipe left and right in hope of finding the best match. His profile was charming, full of witty one-liners and pictures of him traveling, hiking, and generally living what seemed like a perfect life. After chatting for a week, we decided to meet up for drinks at a cozy bar in the city. The evening went well enough. At first we talked about everything from our favorite movies to our childhoods, and the conversation flowed smoothly. About an hour later, Chris excused himself to go to the restroom. I leaned back in my chair, sipping my cocktail and scanning the room. The bar wasn't very busy, but there were enough people to make it feel comfortable. I checked my phone for any messages, but none from friends or family. A few minutes later, I felt the buzz of my phone vibrating on the table, a reminder about a meeting the next morning. I slipped my phone back into my purse and continued to wait for Chris. When he returned, he seemed a little distracted. He didn't seem like he was in any rush, but there was something in his demeanor that felt off. He kept looking around the room as if scanning the crowd. Still, he smiled and apologized for taking so long. "I had to use the bathroom in the back," he said, sitting back down across from me. I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the night was a little strange. It wasn't anything obvious, just a gut feeling I couldn't quite explain. We finished our drinks, and after a bit more small talk, we decided to call it a night. You walked me to my car, where we exchanged a quick goodbye. I was tired but content. There had been some small awkwardness here and there, but nothing that screamed danger. He'd seemed nice enough, even if I didn't feel an overwhelming connection. The next morning, I woke up to the usual grogginess that came with drinking the night before. I rubbed my eyes, grabbed my phone, and checked for any texts. Nothing too exciting. When I finally dragged myself out of bed and went to the kitchen to grab some coffee, I noticed something odd. I have an old, beat-up car that I rarely drive unless I absolutely have to, and I keep it parked in the same spot in my apartment complex. As I was heading to the door, I glanced out the window toward my car and saw something on the underside of it, something metallic. At first, I thought it was just a loose part from the car, maybe from a wheel or the exhaust. But then I remembered that I hadn't noticed anything unusual the night before. Curious, I grabbed my shoes and went outside to investigate. When I got closer to the car, I saw that it was something attached to the underside of the bumper. I knelt down for a better look, and my heart skipped a beat when I realized what it was, a small GPS tracker. It was taped to the underside of the car, barely noticeable unless you were specifically looking for it. My stomach dropped. I knew immediately that this wasn't a coincidence. I didn't even have to think twice. My mind immediately flashed back to the night before, to Chris. I remembered the way he had acted when he returned from the restroom. He seemed normal enough at first, but now that I was reflecting on it, I remembered his odd behavior. Had he been the one to attach the tracker to my car, I felt a wave of panic rise up in me, and my pulse began to race. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm myself. I pulled out my phone and dialed my best friend Jenna. As soon as she picked up, I blurted out what had happened, my voice shaking. "Jenna, something really weird happened. I think someone put a GPS tracker on my car." There was a pause on the other end before she responded. "What, are you serious? Who would do that?" I don't know, I replied, still kneeling beside my car, holding the tracker in my hand. But I met this guy last night on a dating app. His name is Chris. He excused himself to the bathroom, and when he came back he was acting a little off. I'm starting to think he did this. Jenna's voice was filled with concern. You need to get that thing removed, and you need to be careful. This is really creepy. I agreed, my mind still spinning. I'm going to call the police. Don't know what to do. After we hung up, I immediately called a local mechanic to ask if they could remove the GPS tracker from my car for me. The mechanic confirmed that it could be removed, but he also advised me to file a report with the police in case the situation escalated. I didn't want to overreact, but the more I thought about it, the more terrified I became. This wasn't just some innocent prank. This was an invasion of my privacy, and potentially much worse. By the time I managed to get the tracker removed, I felt like a weight had settled in my chest. I couldn't stop thinking about how close Chris had been to me the night before, how he'd been just a few feet away when he might have been placing the tracker on my car. Had he been following me after the date? The thought of someone secretly monitoring me was more than unsettling. It made me feel exposed and vulnerable. That afternoon I went to the police station. I told them everything, from meeting Chris on the dating app to the strange behavior during our date, and of course the tracker on my car. They listened attentively and took notes. They assured me they'd look into it, but said there wasn't much they could do until they found evidence linking Chris to the tracker. The officer mentioned that this kind of thing wasn't uncommon, though it was rare for it to happen after such a short interaction. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the sense of paranoia. I kept checking my car, and I started becoming hyper-aware of my surroundings when I went out. It was he being followed. It was Chris watching me. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I half expected to see him standing there. I never heard from Chris again. He didn't reach out after the date, and I didn't want to contact him anyway. But every time I passed by a car that looked familiar, every time I saw someone with the same jacket he had worn, my heart would race. I couldn't help but wonder if he was still out there watching me, waiting for the right moment to do something more. I deleted my dating profile after that, and for a while I didn't go out much at night. I had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. The whole experience left me wondering how well we really know the people we meet online, and how quickly a seemingly innocent interaction can turn into something far more sinister. I had been looking forward to the weekend getaway for weeks. The idea of escaping the city, leaving behind the constant noise and chaos, felt like the perfect antidote to the stress I'd been feeling at work. The cabin I rented was small, tucked away on the edge of a dense forest, with nothing around for miles except trees and a distant creek. It seemed ideal, a quiet place to clear my mind and relax. The first day was exactly what I needed. I spent most of the afternoon reading on the porch, enjoying the crisp air and the occasional chirp of birds in the trees. The sun set early, and by evening the cabin was enveloped in complete darkness. I made myself a simple dinner and sat down with a book, glad to be away from my usual routine. As night deepened, I started to feel more and more at ease, the isolation almost comforting. It was on the second night that things started to feel off. I woke up around 3 a.m. The silence seemed almost suffocating. I got up to use the bathroom, and as I walked past the kitchen window, I noticed something strange. The back porch light was on. I was certain I hadn't left it on before I went to bed. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, but I couldn't ignore the gnawing sensation in my gut. I decided to take a quick look outside, just to be sure. I pulled on a jacket and stepped out the back door, the cool air biting at my skin. As I walked toward the porch, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, scattered across the wooden floor, were fresh cigarette butts and food wrappers. My first instinct was confusion. I hadn't smoked, and I was certain I'd locked the cabin door before going to bed. I had been alone. Hadn't I? I hadn't seen anyone else in the area since I arrived. I crouched down, examining the mess. The cigarette butts were still warm to the touch, and the wrappers looked like they'd been carelessly tossed aside. I didn't recognize the brand of cigarettes. They weren't mine. I couldn't explain how they'd gotten there. My heart was pounding now, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Who had been here, and why was I so sure I was alone? I quickly stepped back inside, locking the door behind me. I stood in the dark living room, staring at the floor in disbelief. The reality of the situation hadn't quite sunk in yet. There had to be a logical explanation, right? Maybe I just missed something when I arrived. Maybe there was a neighbor who had used the porch for a cigarette and snack. But no, the nearest cabin was miles away, and I hadn't heard a single car or personal weekend. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. Maybe I'd left the porch light on but didn't remember. Maybe the rappers had been there since before I arrived. But the smell of stale cigarette smoke lingered in the air, and the thought of someone being so close to the cabin, someone I hadn't seen, made my skin crawl. I had been alone, and now I wasn't sure of anything. The rest of the night passed in restless sleep, my mind racing with thoughts of what had happened. I kept hearing small creaks and groans in the cabin, sounds that I had dismissed earlier, but now seemed ominous. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone standing just outside the door, waiting. But when I woke up, the morning light brought some relief. The porch was empty, and everything appeared normal again. Maybe I had just been imagining things in the dark. I spent the next day trying to distract myself. I hiked along the trails near the cabin, trying to push away the unsettling feeling that had settled in my chest. But as the sun began to set that evening, I couldn't shake the paranoia. The idea that someone had been on my porch, someone I hadn't seen, lingered in my mind. I tried to tell myself it was all a coincidence, but it didn't feel like one. When night fell again, I kept the lights dimmed inside, hoping to avoid drawing attention from outside. I didn't want to confront whatever or whoever had been there the previous night. But as I sat in the living room trying to relax, I couldn't stop glancing at the back door. What if they came back? The sound of footsteps outside broke the silence. My heart jumped in my chest and I froze. It wasn't loud enough to be someone running, but it was unmistakable, slow, deliberate steps on the gravel path leading to the back porch. I held my breath, straining to listen. It was happening again. Someone was outside. I knew it. I stood up, my legs trembling. I moved toward the window, but the curtains were drawn tight. I couldn't see anything. My mind raced with panic. Who was it? Was it the same person from the night before? I couldn't even tell where the sound was coming from. The back porch, the side of the cabin. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and I felt a cold sweat trickle down my back. The silence returned, stretching on for what seemed like an eternity. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Would they even be able to get here in time? But the idea of standing out there in the dark alone terrified me more than the thought of waiting. I stayed perfectly still, my heart hammering in my chest. Then I heard it, almost imperceptible tapping on the window. My breath caught in my throat. I crept closer to the wall, moving as silently as I could. The tapping came again, soft and rhythmic. It was coming from the back window, the one that overlooked the porch. I didn't know what to do. The fear was consuming me. I was supposed to be alone. I had rented this cabin to escape, relax. But now I felt more trapped than ever. Whoever was out there had been watching me, and I had no idea how to make it stop. I waited in the dark for what felt like hours, not daring to make a sound. The tapping continued intermittently, like someone testing my resolve. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I didn't hear any footsteps anymore. I didn't hear anything. And though I stayed awake, staring at the door, the rest of the night passed in eerie silence. The next morning, I didn't leave the cabin. I packed up my things and checked out early. My mind was too frazzled to stay. I drove away without looking back. But the thought of those cigarette butts, rappers, and the person tapping on my window stayed with me. You'll never know who or what was out there that weekend. But I knew one thing for certain. I would never rent a cabin in the woods again. Story 40. It started on a Wednesday, just like any other day at work. I had parked my car in the same spot in the lot, grabbed my bag, and walked into the office, barely noticing anything out of the ordinary. It wasn't until lunchtime that I came back to my car and found a small, folded piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming it was just a flyer or advertisement. But when I unfolded it, my heart skipped a beat. The note read, "You look beautiful today." That was it. No signature, no other words. I frowned and looked around, expecting to see someone nearby who might have left it. But the parking lot was empty, save for a few scattered cars. I shoved the note in my bag and tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just a random, harmless compliment, I thought. Maybe someone had just noticed me and decided to say something kind. Over the next few days, the notes kept coming. Every time I returned to my car, there was another note. Sometimes it was tucked under the windshield wiper. Sometimes it was slipped between the side mirror and the door. Each note had the same words. "You looked beautiful today," written in a careful, almost deliberate nattering. No signature, just the same message day after day. My mind started to race. Who could be leaving these and why? I tried to brush it off at first, telling myself it was a harmless gesture, maybe even a coincidence. But the frequency with which the notes appeared began to unsettle me. The fact that no one had approached me or spoken to me directly made it feel even more strange. The notes felt almost invasive, like a quiet observation of my every movement. They seemed to be waiting for me, ready to appear each time I returned to my car. By the end of the week, I had found 5 notes in total. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I even started to double-check the parking lot when I arrived in the mornings, making sure no one was lingering around watching me. But there was never anyone there. No faces peeking out from behind trees or cars. No signs that anyone was keeping track of me. It was as though the notes appeared out of thin air. I told my friend Claire about it over lunch one day, thinking it would make me feel better to talk about it. She seemed concerned but also a bit amused. "Maybe it's just a harmless crush," she suggested. "Someone who likes you and is too shy to say it to your face." But I wasn't convinced. There was something off about it, something that didn't sit right. The notes weren't flattering, they were just strange, too vague, too disconnected. The next week, the notes kept coming. Every day, without fail. "You looked beautiful today." The same phrase written on fresh sheets of paper. I started taking a different route to my car, hoping to avoid whatever or whoever was leaving them. But no matter how carefully I tried to avoid detection, the notes still found their way to me. They were always waiting for me, like a presence I couldn't escape. By this point, I was starting to feel genuinely uncomfortable. I started changing my routine at work, coming in earlier and leaving later, but the notes followed me. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, constantly checking the parking lot for any signs of movement. I wondered if I was being paranoid, but a growing sense of dread told me that something wasn't right. One evening, as I was walking back to my car after a late meeting, I spotted something different. The usual note was waiting for me under the windshield wiper, but this time the message was different. It read, "I see you every day. You don't even know I'm watching you." My stomach dropped. It felt like a punch in the gut, like the note had crossed a line. This wasn't just a compliment anymore. This was a warning, a declaration of something far more sinister. That night, I barely slept. I thought about the note over and over again, wondering who could be behind it and what they wanted. Was it someone from work? Was it a complete stranger who had somehow learned my schedule? I didn't know, and that was what terrified me. I didn't want to tell anyone else, fearing I'd sound paranoid or overly dramatic, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted in a way that I couldn't fully understand. The next morning, I decided to take action. I went straight to my car, expecting the usual note, but this time there was something else. The note was still there, but next to it was a photograph. It was a blurry, poorly taken picture of me walking to my car the previous day. My heart raced as I looked at the photo. It was taken from behind a bush near the entrance to the parking lot. Whoever had been leaving the notes had been watching me for much longer than I'd realized. I immediately called the police. They were concerned, but without concrete evidence or a clear threat. They didn't have much to go on. They suggested installing a camera or trying to change my routine even more. But I knew it wasn't enough. I needed to know who was behind this, and I needed it to stop. Over the next few days, I took extra precautions. I parked in different spots, left work at odd hours, and watched the parking lot like a hawk. But the notes kept coming. Each one was more unnerving than the last. Each one reminding me that someone was watching. "You're so beautiful when you're alone," one of the notes read. "I know where you go when you leave here," said another. I became obsessed with finding the person behind the notes. I even started taking pictures of the notes when I found them, hoping it would be enough to track down whoever was doing this. But every time I thought I was getting closer, the notes stopped, only to start again with a new message. It was as if they were trying to play a game with me, keeping me on edge and guessing at every turn. The last note I found read, "I've been here the whole time, watching you. Don't worry.
You're not going anywhere."
I didn't know if that meant they had been watching me for weeks or if it was just a threat meant to make me feel powerless. All I knew was that I was done. I couldn't take it anymore. I reported it again, this time demanding more help. I started looking for a new place to work, somewhere far away from the building and its strange, unsettling watcher. I haven't seen a note in weeks, but the fear hasn't gone away. I still check my car every time I leave work, still watch the shadows in the parking lot. I still wonder who they were and why they felt the need to make me feel so watched. Story 50. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon, and I had just settled in for a relaxing day at home. My dog Max was curled up next to me on the couch, his usual calm demeanor adding to the peaceful atmosphere. I had just turned on the TV to watch a movie when he suddenly shot up, barking frantically at the closet door. His ears were pinned back, and his tail was stiff and alert. I recognized one that always signaled something was off. I glanced at the clock. There was no reason for him to be this agitated. The house was empty except for the two of us, and there hadn't been any strange noises or events. I shushed him, thinking maybe he just heard something outside, but Max didn't stop. He barked and whined, pacing back and forth in front of the door as if trying to get my attention in the most desperate way. I sighed, thinking maybe a toy had rolled under the door. But when I looked over, I saw nothing out of place. Max's barking grew more insistent, almost frantic. It was unsettling, the way he wouldn't stop. I got up from the couch, my unease growing. I patted his head to calm him, but he didn't seem reassured. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the closet door. The more I looked at it, the more I felt a creeping sense of dread wash over me. Nothing about the door seemed unusual, but there was something about the way Max was reacting that didn't sit right. I decided to check it out, partly to calm Max down and partly because my curiosity was getting the better of me. I walked toward the door, my footsteps slow and deliberate. Max kept barking, though now it almost sounded like a warning, as if he were telling me to stay away. But I wasn't going to leave it like this. I had to know what was bothering him. The door creaked as I slowly pulled it open. Max's barking stopped abruptly, and a deep silence filled the room. My heart thudded loudly in my chest. The closet was dark as expected, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. At first glance, there were the usual items: coats, shoes, a few boxes stacked on a shelf. But then, saw it. Sitting on the floor, partially hidden behind a stack of old blankets, was a cell phone. I knelt down, staring at it for a moment, unsure of what I was looking at. The phone wasn't mine. I didn't recognize it, and it certainly hadn't been there when I had last cleaned the closet. It was an older model with a cracked screen, but the fact that it was just sitting there motionless and seemingly forgotten sent a chill down my spine. There was no reason for it to be there. I hadn't left it there, and no one had come by. I reached for it, my hand trembling slightly as I picked it up. The phone felt cold in my hands, and I noticed the screen was still on. It didn't have a password, which was odd. I wasn't expecting it to be unlocked. I hesitated for a moment before I pressed the button to check the videos. I had to know what was going on. The first thing I saw was a grainy video of my living room. It looked like it had been filmed from the spot where Max had been barking earlier, directly facing the couch. The video was shaky, but it was clear enough to make out details. It was my living room, my couch, and the TV. The camera zoomed in on the spot where Max was curled up earlier. Then the video cut to static for a few seconds, only to resume with a view of the closet door. My closet door. My stomach dropped. I scrolled down, my hands now shaking harder, and found several more videos. Each one was of different areas in my home, always filmed from hidden angles. The videos were taken at different times of the day. Some showed me walking in and out of rooms, others of me sitting on the couch, unaware. But the worst part was that the camera had been set up in places I hadn't even noticed, behind a curtain, under the coffee table, and most disturbingly inside my closet. I looked at the closet again, feeling the weight of what I had just discovered settle into my chest. Who had done this? Why? And how had they gotten the phone into my house without me noticing? I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the walls were closing in. My mind raced as I tried to process the nightmare unfolding before me. This was no accident. Someone had been in my home without my knowledge. Max, who had been eerily quiet since I opened the door, suddenly nudged me with his nose, pulling me out of my trance. I looked down at him, and he gazed up at me, with wide, concerned eyes. I realized then that I had been holding my breath and let it out slowly. My fingers hovered over the phone, unsure what to do next. I didn't want to call the police just yet. I needed more answers, something more concrete. But I knew I couldn't just ignore this. I scrolled through the videos again, looking for any clue or sign that could tell me who had been behind this. And then I found it. In one of the videos, there was a figure. The person was blurry, their face obscured by shadows, but they were standing just out of view in the corner of the room. They didn't seem to move, but I could tell they were watching me. I froze, my heart raced. Whoever had done this was still watching me. The thought made my skin crawl. I immediately stood up and walked over to the window, peering outside, half expecting someone to be lurking in the shadows. There was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, waiting. I snapped out of my daze when the phone buzzed in my hand. The screen flickered, and I saw a new message pop up. It was a text, but the number was unfamiliar. It read, "In watching, you're never alone." I dropped the phone as if it had burned me. My thoughts spun wildly. The text wasn't just a thread, it was a confirmation. The person who had been filming me knew exactly where I was. They knew everything about my routine, about my home, and now they were reaching out. I grabbed Max and locked all the doors, my mind spinning out of control. My phone was now buzzing with notifications, texts, calls, and messages I didn't want to open. Whoever was behind this was far too close, and I didn't know how much time I had before they decided to make themselves known. Story 6. The air was crisp, and the sky was a soft purple as I laced up my running shoes. He'd always preferred jogging at dusk. The cooling air and quiet streets made it feel like my own personal time to clear my head. The neighborhood was mostly empty, except for the occasional dog walker or someone on their porch, and the distant hum of a car. As I started my jog, the familiar rhythm of my feet hitting the pavement calmed me, and the world seemed far away. I decided to take my usual route through the small park just outside the neighborhood, a place I'd passed by dozens of times. It was a wide open field with a few scattered trees and a walking trail that cut through the center. I liked it because it was peaceful, and I always felt like I could lose myself in the space, even if only for a little while. As I turned the corner of the park, I noticed something strange. There was a man standing in the middle of the field, perfectly still. He wasn't moving, not an inch. At first, I thought he might be some kind of statue or a jogger taking a break, but that didn't seem right. His posture was too rigid, his arms hanging at his sides, and there was something unsettling about the way he stared directly at me. It wasn't just a glance or casual eye contact, it was like he was watching me intently, studying my every movement. The eerie stillness of it made me instinctively pick up my pace. As I passed the edge of the field, I tried to shake off the feeling creeping up my spine. Maybe he was just someone waiting for someone else. Or maybe he was lost and thought, but something about his unmoving presence in the center of the field felt out of place. I glanced over my shoulder once to see if he was still standing there. And sure enough, he was. His gaze hadn't shifted, and he didn't move a muscle. I tried to focus on the rhythm of my breathing as I jogged further, pushing the image of him to the back of my mind. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't shake the image of him standing there, just staring at me. It was hard to ignore how unnatural it felt. He remained in the exact same spot, perfectly still, like a figure frozen in time. 20 minutes later, I was back near the park, my legs burning with the exertion of the run. I slowed my pace as I neared the field, preparing to head back home. It was a quiet evening. The sun dipped lower and cast long shadows across the ground. As I approached the park again, I glanced to my left, dreading that I'd see him still standing there. To my surprise, he was. The man had not moved an inch from where I'd last seen him. His head was slightly tilted, but his eyes were locked on me. Just as before, I could feel my heart rate spike, and my legs instinctively picked up speed. I tried not to look back again, but the image of him standing in the middle of the field was burned into my mind. It was as if he was waiting for me, or perhaps following me in some way, even without moving. I reached the corner of the park and kept running, not daring to slow down. My breath came faster now, a mixture of exertion and growing unease. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I needed to get as far away from that field as possible. The man's presence in the park had felt off, unnatural even, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept running, my feet hitting the pavement hard, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. When I finally turned the corner and out of sight of the park, I slowed down, trying to catch my breath. The streets were still quiet, and there was no one around to share this unsettling feeling with. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that I was overreacting, but the image of him standing there perfectly still, just staring at me, kept replaying in my mind. I pushed the thought aside as I jogged the final stretch toward home. I didn't look back, didn't let myself think about the man standing there in the field. But when I turned onto my street and saw my house ahead, the unease still lingered in my stomach. I didn't want to think about the man anymore, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, watching me. Later that night, I tried to shake off the odd feeling, but it was hard to ignore. I couldn't stop thinking about how he hadn't moved at all. Not even once. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail in my mind. Was he waiting for someone? Had he been waiting for me? My mind raced with possibilities, but nothing made sense. It was as though he'd been placed there to watch me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something I didn't. The next day, I decided to go for a jog again. I didn't want to let fear control me, so I took the same route, determined to get past the weirdness of the previous night. As I approached the park, I was relieved to see the field was empty, no man standing still in the middle of it, and no unnerving gaze following my every move. But as I ran through the park, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. My mind kept drifting back to that moment the night before. The man's eyes locked onto me from across the field. Even now, as I jogged past the spot where he had been standing, I couldn't help but felt that strange presence, like he was still there, somehow watching me. Story 7. I was driving home late one evening after finishing a long shift at work. The roads were mostly empty, with only a few cars scattered here and there. My car's headlights cut through the darkness as I cruised along the highway, taking in the familiar route to my apartment. Just as I was about to turn onto a side street, I noticed a set of headlights behind me, unusually close. At first, I thought it was just another driver in a hurry. Maybe they were tailgating because they were impatient or running late. But as I continued down the road, I realized the car wasn't backing off. The vehicle stayed right behind me, a constant presence in my rearview mirror. I shifted my attention to the road ahead, trying to ignore it, but the feeling of being followed crept into my mind. I took a few more turns, hoping to lose the car, but it stayed with me. Each time I veered off onto a different street, the car mirrored my every move, maintaining the same unnerving distance. It was like they knew exactly where I was going. A knot formed in my stomach as I considered the possibility that I wasn't just being followed randomly. A sense of dread began to settle over me. I tried to remain calm, but my hands gripped the steering wheel tighter with each passing block. The eerie silence in my car only made the situation worse. The hum of the tires on the pavement was too loud, and the otherwise still night seemed oppressive. I tried to keep my cool and focus on the road, but my mind kept racing through possible scenarios. What if they were just lost? What if they had no ill intentions? But deep down, I knew something felt off. I took a sharp right turn, hoping to throw the car off. But the headlights never wavered. They followed me, unwavering, like a shadow. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. A strange paranoia washed over me as I realized I couldn't shake this person off. No matter how many turns I made, no matter how much I changed my route, they were right there. After about 15 minutes of playing this cat and mouse game, I decided to take things up a notch. I accelerated slightly, making sharp turns, hoping the driver would get frustrated and turn away. But the car never slowed down, it never swerved out of the way. It stayed behind me like a dark presence that refused to let go. I glanced at my phone to see if I could call someone, or at least pull up a map. My hands were trembling, but I managed to dial my friend, hoping to talk things through, maybe distract myself from the rise in panic. The phone rang once, then twice, but she didn't pick up. I didn't want to go to the police just yet, not when I wasn't sure if I was overreacting. But as the minutes ticked by, I grew more convinced that this wasn't a coincidence. I decided to take a longer detour. I turned off onto a secluded road that would lead me to an industrial area, places where I knew I could get lost in the maze of back streets. I took sharp left and right turns, speeding up whenever I could to get ahead. Still, the car stayed behind me like a dark shadow without hesitation. I couldn't help but wonder if they were trying to intimidate me, or if they were trying to figure out my next move. Each time I checked the rearview mirror, the headlights were still there, close, relentless. My breathing grew more shallow. It had been nearly an hour of this now. I felt the creeping sense of doom, like something was about to happen, that I couldn't control. I thought about pulling over, but what would that accomplish? If they were following me with bad intentions, getting out of the car could be dangerous.
I was alone, miles from home, in an unfamiliar part of town.
The thoughts swirled in my head, each one darker than the last. I needed to stop this. I needed to do something to regain control of the situation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I spotted a police station up ahead, brightly lit against the night. Without hesitation, I made a sharp left turn and headed straight for it. As soon as I entered the parking lot, I slammed on the brakes and parked near the entrance. My hands were shaking as I put the car in park. I looked up, expecting the car behind me to follow. But it didn't. The headlights were gone. For a moment I sat there, catching my breath. My heart was still racing. I was in a safe place now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the car had been a predator, stalking me for the entire hour. My hands were clammy as I stepped out of the car and rushed to the front door of the station. I pushed it open and walked in. The cool air inside was a sharp contrast to the heat of panic still coursing through me. A police officer at the desk looked up at me, his expression neutral. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice calm and professional. "I think someone's been following me," I said, my voice unsteady. "I've been driving around for almost an hour, and this car has been tailgating me the whole time. No matter how many turns I made, they stayed behind me. I think they're still out there." The officer's eyes narrowed slightly as he stood up. He motioned for another officer to join him. "Let's take a look at the cameras," he said. As we walked back to the station's security room, I glanced out the window toward the parking lot, half expecting to see the car still lingering in the shadows, but the lot was empty. The security footage confirmed that the car had indeed followed me. It wasn't a coincidence. The officers took down my information and the details of the car, asking if I could recall any distinguishing features. I gave them as much detail as I could, but the anxiety still clung to me, making it hard to focus. The police promised to keep an eye on the area and run a check on the car's plate, but I wasn't reassured. The way they followed me, the relentless persistence was too calculated. I had no idea who they were or what their intentions had been, but the fear in the pit of my stomach wouldn't go away. I sat in the police station for a while waiting until I finally felt ready to drive home. The drive back was quiet. Usually so. The streets were empty now, and my car felt more like a cage than a vehicle. I couldn't stop glancing in the rearview mirror, checking for any sign of headlights, but there was nothing. Only the silent hum of the road beneath me, the haunting memory of being followed still fresh in my mind. Story 18. I had been waiting outside for about 10 minutes when I saw the headlights of a car coming down the street. My phone pinged with a notification. Rideshare has arrived. I double-checked the details on the app. License plate, make, and model all matched what I'd been expecting. The car rolled to a stop in front of me, and I could hear the hum of the engine as it idled. It was the right car, or so I thought. I approached the vehicle and opened the door, but when I glanced inside, something felt off. The man behind the wheel wasn't the driver I had been expecting. I had a brief moment of confusion, but then I reminded myself that rideshare services sometimes send someone else when the original driver is unavailable. Still, my stomach twisted as I noticed that the man didn't match the profile picture on the app. "Are you my neighbor?" he asked in a tone that seemed too calm for the situation. His voice wasn't unfriendly, but there was something strange about it, something I couldn't quite place. I nodded, but a spark of doubt shot through me. He didn't look like the person I had seen in the app's photo. The driver I'd expected had a beard, but this man was clean-shaven with short, dark hair. His eyes were intense, but they didn't have the warmth I expected. "Yeah, that's me," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "But, you're not the driver from the app." My voice trailed off as I scanned his face. He didn't seem to react to the uncertainty in my tone. Instead, he smiled, and it was an unsettling smile. It wasn't warm or reassuring. It was more like a practice grin, the kind someone would use to mask discomfort or perhaps to hide something darker. The man gave a small, dismissive wave. "The app must be wrong," he said, his voice still too smooth. "It's me. You can trust me." He gestured toward the seat beside him, motioning for me to get in. "I've been assigned to use or just hop in. It's a long ride and I don't want to waste your time." I hesitated, my hand still gripping the door handle. The car was running and the air around us was thick with tension. I knew I was being paranoid, but there was a nagging feeling at the back of my mind that I couldn't shake. Something was off about this situation. "I'm not sure," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "The app says the driver is someone else." He leaned back in his seat, clearly getting impatient. "Don't worry about it," he said, his tone more insistent now. "It's me. and I'm here to take you where you need to go. Let's not waste time, all right? The words were polite, but the undercurrent of something darker was unmistakable. I glanced at the app again, hoping to see something that might calm my nerves, but there was no option to cancel the ride. My heart began to race as I looked back at the man. I wanted to call the police right then and there, but I didn't know what I'd say. Would they believe me? Could I even prove that anything was wrong? I took a step back, keeping my hand on the door. "I'm going to call the police," I said, my voice coming out more firm than I felt. "I'm not getting in the car until I know who you are." The man's expression changed in an instant. His smile vanished and his eyes narrowed. The shift was so quick it almost made my stomach flip. "Listen," he said, his voice suddenly cold. "Get in the car. I don't want to make this difficult." There was a quiet menace in his words, something that sent a shiver down my spine. I knew then that I had made a mistake. I was about to pull my phone out of my pocket when the man slammed his foot on the gas. The car surged forward with surprising speed, and the door slammed shut before I could react. My heart pounded as I fumbled with the handle, but it wouldn't open. The door was locked from the inside, and the car was already moving too fast for me to jump out. I was in the car now, trapped. I had no choice but to face the reality that I was alone with this man, and he wasn't letting me go. I pressed my back against the seat, trying to calm my breathing, but panic began to rise. The app was still open on my phone, but I couldn't even focus on it. All I could do was look at him, waiting for some sign that he was going to explain himself. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice trembling more than I cared to admit. The man didn't respond immediately. His fingers tightened on the steering wheel, and for a moment I thought he might ignore me completely. Then he turned his head slightly, just enough for me to see his eyes. "Don't worry about that," he said, his voice eerily calm. "We're just going to take a little ride. That's all." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I wasn't sure if it was the tone of his voice or the way he spoke, but it made my blood run cold. I could tell he was trying to keep me calm, but it only made me more nervous. The car sped down the road faster than I was comfortable with, and the silence between us was suffocating. I didn't know what to do. Should I scream? Should I try to jump out of the car and run? But it was too late for that. I was already trapped in a moving vehicle with a man who refused to explain himself. The thought of jumping out of the car crossed my mind, but I knew the risk of getting hurt if I tried. My phone buzzed in my hand, and I quickly glanced at it. The police hadn't responded yet, but I saw a notification from the app that the driver had cancelled the ride.
I realized with a jolt that this man wasn't a legitimate driver at all.
He had somehow hijacked the ride, but it was too late for me to get any information or alert anyone. I finally managed to find my voice. "Pull over," I demanded, trying to sound confident. "I'm not going anywhere with you. You need to let me out now." The man laughed a low, unsettling chuckle that sent a ripple of fear through me. "You should have gotten in when you had the chance," he said. "So now you'll have to come with me." Just as I was about to scream, the car suddenly swerved to the side of the road and came to a screeching halt. My heart was pounding in my chest. But the man didn't get out. Instead, he turned toward me, his eyes colder than before. "You can get out now," he said quietly, his grin fading. "But remember, you're the one who decided to refuse me." He leaned back in his seat, watching me closely. Without thinking, I scrambled out of the car and ran as fast as I could down the street, not stopping until I reached the nearest public place. I called the police immediately. By the time they arrived, the car and the man were gone. Story 9. I worked the closing shift at the bookstore for almost a year, and by now the routine was second nature. I tidied up the shelves, counted the register, and locked the front door with a final glance at the empty store. It was always quiet in the evenings, and I appreciated the calm. The bookstore sat at the edge of a small shopping plaza, and after hours it felt isolated, with only the occasional car driving by. On that particular night, the air was colder than usual for a late spring evening. I finished locking up and grabbed my bag, ready to head home. The parking lot was empty except for my car and one other parked near the far corner, its headlights off. I was used to the emptiness, but tonight something felt different. It was as if the quiet had thickened, pressing in on me, making every sound seem louder. As I walked toward my car, I noticed a shadow moving between two vehicles parked next to the row I was in. At first I thought it was just a stray animal, maybe a raccoon or a cat, rooting through the trash cans by the dumpsters. But when I looked closer, I realized it was a man. He was crouched low to the ground, his back hunched, and he was holding something in his hands. The light from the street lamps above reflected off the object, revealing a metallic glint, something shiny and possibly a knife or some kind of tool. My heart rate quickened. I had no reason to believe he had seen me yet, but something about the way he was positioned, so hidden in the shadows, sent a shiver down my spine. I froze for a moment, trying to assess the situation. The man didn't seem to be aware of me. His attention was completely focused on whatever he was holding. He seemed to be fiddling with it, and the metallic object caught the light every time he shifted. I thought about going back inside the store to call the police, but something in my gut told me not to turn my back on him. If he was dangerous, I'd be vulnerable with my back to him. I glanced around the parking lot, looking for anything that might help me, but there was nothing. I was alone, and the parking lot felt far too quiet. I slowly moved closer to my car, trying to keep my movements as calm and quiet as possible. My mind raced with questions. Who was this guy? And what was he doing here at this hour? I'd worked late many times before, and I'd never encountered anything like this. I thought about calling out, but that felt like it might provoke him. He didn't seem to be aware of me yet, and I wasn't sure what would happen if I broke the silence. When I reached my car, I paused. The man was still crouching between the two vehicles, his focus still on whatever was in his hands. I considered my options. I could try to get into the car and drive off quickly, but that might escalate things. I could also run inside the store and lock myself in, but I was too far from the door to get there before he noticed. I was caught in a tense limbo, trying to think of the best course of action. That's when the man's head jerked up, his eyes wide like he'd sensed me somehow. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I met his gaze, though it wasn't clear if he had actually seen me or if I had just caught his attention in some way. I couldn't move. For a moment, we just stared at each other across the empty parking lot. His face was partially obscured by a hood, but I could make out the faint outline of his features, rough, unshaven, with eyes that seemed strangely wide, almost manic. Then, without a word, he stood up quickly, the metallic object still gripped tightly in his hand. My pulse hammered in my ears. I had no idea what he was planning to do, but I didn't wait to find out. I ducked low, trying to stay out of sight, and hurried around the front of my car, hoping the vehicle would give me some cover. I didn't dare look back to see what he was doing, but I could hear his footsteps, moving quickly and erratically like he was circling the area. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling as I fumbled to unlock it. My mind was racing. Should I call the police now? But would they arrive in time? I could still hear his footsteps in the distance, getting closer. He wasn't far from me now, and I wasn't sure how much time I had before he might notice me again. The phone finally unlocked, and I dialed 911 with shaking hands. The operator picked up on the first ring, and I tried to keep my voice steady as I whispered into the phone, explaining the situation. There's a man in the parking lot. He's crouched by my car, and I think he's holding a weapon. I don't know what he's doing, but I'm scared. The operator reassured me that help was on the way and asked me to stay on the line. I kept my eyes on the man as best I could, trying not to make any noise, but I could still hear him moving around in the shadows. Every time I thought I might make a break for it, I heard another shift, another scuffle of shoes against the asphalt. Then, just as suddenly as he'd appeared, he stopped. The footsteps ceased, and for a moment everything was still. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't dare move, waiting for some sign of what he would do next. But there was nothing, no sounds, no movement. It was like he had vanished. I didn't wait to find out if he was still there. I took a deep breath and sprinted toward the store's back entrance, my heart pounding in my chest. I slammed the door behind me, locked it, and crouched down, hiding behind the counter. The adrenaline was still rushing through me, making it hard to think clearly. I could barely hear anything outside. The police arrived just minutes later, and I shakily told them everything I had seen. By the time they reached the parking lot, the man was gone, and there was no sign of him or the object he had been holding. The officers searched the area but found nothing unusual. I was left with more questions than answers. That night I couldn't shake the feeling that his eyes were on me. I never found out who he was or why he was there, but the memory of that night still lingers, especially when I work closing shifts. I'm always looking over my shoulder now, half expecting to see him again. The night was quiet, the kind of deep silence that only comes with the late hours when the city is at rest. I was in a deep sleep, curled up under the blanket, drifting between dreams and reality. The air in the apartment was still. The hum of the refrigerator was the only noise filling the room. I hadn't noticed when the clock had struck 2 in the morning. Then I heard it. A soft creak, faint but sharp enough to pull me from my slumber. My eyes snapped open, my heart rate picking up in an instant. It was the sound of something heavy shifting, a footstep or the weight of a door moving. I lay still for a moment, unsure if it had been part of a dream. But when I heard the creak again, louder this time, a chill crawled up my spine. I sat up in bed trying to make sense of what was happening. The apartment was dark, save for the faint moonlight slipping through the curtains. My mind raced through all the possibilities. Had I left something on in the kitchen? Was it just the house settling? But no, this was different, too distinct, too deliberate. I swung my legs out of bed and stood. The hardwood floor was cold under my bare feet. My pulse hammered in my chest as I crept toward the living room. The apartment was small, with just one bedroom in a short hallway that led to the door. As I walked through the silent space, I felt a wave of unease wash over me. Something was wrong. The door to the hallway was ajar. I could see the dim outline of the entryway, and as I approached it, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The creaking sound stopped, but my unease only deepened. I reached the door, pausing to listen. But everything was silent again, too silent. I slowly pushed the door open, and my stomach dropped. The front door was wide open, hanging loosely on its hinges. The chain lock, the very lock I checked before going to bed, was cut clean through. The metal had been sliced with precision, leaving the lock dangling uselessly by a single screw. My breath caught in my throat. I could feel the blood drain from my face. How had this happened? I distinctly remembered locking the door before going to bed. The chain had always been my safeguard, the last thing I did each night. I stepped into the hallway, my feet heavy against the floor, my mind spinning with questions I couldn't answer. I cautiously walked toward the door, trying not to make a sound, though every step felt like it might echo through the empty apartment. The night air rushed in, cool against my skin. I stopped just a few feet from the door. The darkness outside beyond the threshold made me feel like I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't understand. The streetlights outside cast faint, wavering shadows against the wall. But there was no sign of anyone. No footsteps in the hallway, no movement in the shadows. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I checked the small entry table near the door, hoping that I'd simply forgotten to lock it, or that maybe the wind had blown it open. But there was no sign of anything amiss. No broken window, no signs of forced entry. It was as if the door had been opened from the inside. I stepped closer, cautiously scanning the empty street below. The silence outside was as unnerving as the quiet inside. Nothing stirred. No cars passed by, no people walking down the street. Just the stillness of the night pressing in on me. I hesitated, wondering if I should call someone, but a voice in my head told me not to. What could I say? That the door was open. That someone had cut the chain lock? I didn't want to sound paranoid, but the unease in my stomach was growing, gnawing at me like a constant whisper. I slowly backed away from the door, my mind still racing. The weight of the situation was beginning to settle in. Who had been in my apartment? What had they been looking for? I couldn't shake the thought that someone had been here, standing in the dark, watching me while I slept. The idea that someone had been in my home while I was completely unaware of it made my skin crawl. I moved quickly, locking the door behind me. The sound of the lock clicking into place felt reassuring, but only momentarily. The image of the cut chain stayed with me. It wasn't something that could be easily explained away. Whoever had done this knew what they were doing. This wasn't some random break-in. It felt calculated and deliberate. I grabbed my phone and called my best friend, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained what had happened. She told me to stay calm, to lock all the doors and check the windows, and to call the police if I felt unsafe. But the idea of waiting for someone to arrive felt impossible. I felt trapped in my own apartment, as if the very space I had always felt safe in was now unfamiliar, even hostile. I went from room to room, checking every window, every lock, and every corner of the apartment. I felt like I was living in a nightmare. How had someone gotten in? Why had they left the door open? I found nothing out of place. My laptop was still on the desk. My TV remote was on the coffee table, and the kitchen was clean and orderly. There was no sign of struggle or anything stolen. Yet, the feeling of being watched lingered. I turned off all the lights and sat in the living room, waiting. My phone was in my hand and I kept checking the screen for any sign of life, any notification that might break the tension in the air, but there was nothing. No calls, no messages, just the creeping sense of dread building inside me. A few minutes later, I heard a sound coming from the hallway. I froze, a soft creak like the sound of a floorboard giving way under pressure. My heart leapt into my throat. I was alone in the apartment, at least I thought I was. I stood up slowly, my hands shaking. I looked toward the hallway, my eyes wide in the dark. Every instinct told me to leave, to run. But I couldn't move. The apartment felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing in with every passing second. Suddenly, there was another creak, closer this time. My breath caught in my chest, and I knew I wasn't alone anymore. Story 2. My best friend Emma had been talking about this guy she met online for weeks. His name was Ryan, and he seemed perfect, handsome, charming, and attentive. He had all the right things to say in his messages and had a way of making her laugh even through the phone screen. She was really excited when he asked her out on a date, and I could tell she was already picturing the two of them together. But I wasn't so sure. I'd heard a few stories from friends of friends about people meeting shady characters online, so I made it clear that I would be tagging along for safety. The plan was simple. I would be a silent third wheel at a nearby coffee shop. I'd sit at a table across the room pretending to read a book, keeping an eye on things without being intrusive. Emma wasn't thrilled about it at first, but I could tell she appreciated the gesture. After all, there was still risks in meeting strangers, even when you thought you knew everything about them from their profile. The night of the date arrived, and Emma was a bundle of excitement. She wore her favorite dress, the one that made her feel confident, and spent extra time getting her makeup just right. I could tell she wanted this to work out, and I really hoped it would. As we drove to the coffee shop, she kept talking about Ryan, how cute his profile pictures were, how he seemed to have the perfect balance of funny and serious. It was hard not to get caught up in her enthusiasm, but a part of me stayed cautious, wondering if something didn't quite feel right. When we arrived, Ryan was already sitting at a table near the window with a cup of coffee in front of him. He stood up when we walked in, and I could tell right away that he looked a little different from his photos. He was still attractive, but his features seemed a bit more worn than I expected. His smile was a little too wide, almost nervous. He gave Emma a hug, and I could see her eyes light up as she introduced him to me. We exchanged pleasantries, and then Emma and Ryan started talking about their shared interests, mostly movies, mukes, and travel. I watched them closely, gauging the chemistry between them. At first everything seemed fine. Ryan was polite and there was no hint of anything unusual. He laughed at Emma's jokes and seemed genuinely interested in what she had to say. I didn't feel like I needed to step in or make my presence known too much. But as the evening wore on, I started noticing small things that didn't sit right with me. For one, Ryan seemed to keep looking at me whenever Emma wasn't paying attention, like he was sizing me up. He wasn't overtly creepy, but his gaze was sharp, almost too calculating. It made my skin crawl, and I couldn't help but wonder if he was only pretending to be the charming guy Emma thought he was. After about an hour, Emma and Ryan decided to go for a walk outside. I had already planned to give them some space, but I stayed close enough to keep an eye on them from a distance. It was a quiet street, not many people around. I felt my anxiety creeping up again. I waited until they reached the end of the block, then turned to walk back to the coffee shop. That's when I saw Ryan glance over his shoulder, his eyes locking onto mine for a split second. It wasn't just a passing glance. It was a sharp, almost predatory look that sent a shiver down my spine. I quickly turned away, hoping he hadn't noticed me watching. The rest of the evening passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. When we left the coffee shop, Emma seemed thrilled about how well the date had gone. Ryan had asked her if she wanted to meet up again, and she was already talking about the next time they'd hang out. I didn't want to ruin her excitement, so I kept my thoughts to myself. But I was still uneasy about him. There was something about Ryan that felt off, even if I couldn't pinpoint what it was. Later that night, as we sat in Emma's living room, she was texting him, gushing about how great he was. I sat quietly on the couch, my mind playing out the evening. Something about the way Ryan had acted was bothering me, so I decided to do a little digging. Emma had given me his first name and a vague idea of where he lived, so I searched for him online, curious to see if I could find anything. I wasn't expecting anything major, but what I found made my blood run cold. It started with his name, which didn't seem to match up with any of his social media profiles. I tried searching variations of his name, but nothing concrete came up. Then I dug deeper. I found a few articles and old court records under a name I hadn't seen before. Ryan wasn't his real name. He had been involved in several stalking incidents in the past using a different identity entirely. The more I read, the more my stomach dropped. There were police reports, restraining orders, and court appearances all linked to this other name, some of which were shockingly recent. I felt a cold wave of realization wash over me. This wasn't just a guy Emma had met online. This was someone with a history of targeting women. I felt sick to my stomach as I put my phone down and stared at the screen. My first instinct was to call Emma and tell her what I had found, but I didn't want to panic her. She was already infatuated with him, and I knew how badly she wanted things to work out. I couldn't bear the thought of being the one to shatter that, but I knew I had to act fast. I could already imagine what might happen if she continued seeing him without knowing the truth. The next morning I decided to take a direct approach. I asked Emma if we could talk about something important, and after a bit of prodding she agreed. I told her about my findings on Ryan's real name and his criminal history. At first she didn't believe me. She thought I was just being paranoid, but when I showed her the articles and records I had found, her face went pale. She went quiet, processing the information, and I could see the shock and disbelief slowly settle in. It was a hard conversation, one I never wanted to have. But Emma eventually realized that she had been blindsided. The next day, she cut ties with Ryan and blocked him on all social media. A few weeks later, she told me that Ryan had sent her several more messages, but she never responded. We both felt relieved, but it was hard not to feel a lingering sense of violation. Someone had been playing a dangerous game, and we were lucky to have caught it before it went too far. Looking back, I still shudder to think about what might have happened if I hadn't gone digging. Emma's life could have taken a much darker turn, and I'd like to think that our friendship and my instinct to protect her kept her safe that night. Story: the day had been perfect for camping. Clear skies, warm sun, and the quiet serenity of the forest. I'd been hiking for hours, trying to get as far off the beaten path as possible. My goal was solitude, a chance to disconnect from everything and recharge. By the time I set up my tent, the sun was dipping low on the horizon, casting long shadows between the trees. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant call of a bird. I built a small fire, cooked a quick meal, and settled in to watch the flames flicker. It felt good to be alone out there, away from the noise and chaos of daily life. The air was crisp, the woods darkening around me as the night began to fall. I was just finishing my meal when I started to hear something, a soft crunching noise. At first I thought it might be an animal, a deer or something harmless moving through the brush. But the sound came again, closer this time, and I realized it wasn't just one or two steps. Someone or something was moving around my tent. I sat still, trying to listen more closely. The noise came and went in irregular intervals, circling my tent. It was too deliberate to be an animal, too rhythmic, as if whoever was out there was trying to avoid making the sound, but failing. My heart began to race. It wasn't just the sound of footsteps. It was the sound of someone pacing around me. I swallowed hard, trying to push down a rising panic. I told myself it was just my imagination, that it was probably a deer or another hiker passing by. But deep down I knew that wasn't true. I clutched the flashlight next to me but didn't turn it on. I didn't want whoever or whatever was out there to know I was awake. I strained to hear, hoping the footsteps would stop, but they didn't. It felt like hours passed, with the slow, measured crunching moving in a circle around my tent. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I was just hearing things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every time I thought the footsteps had stopped, they would start again, as if someone was testing my reactions. I pressed my ear to the tent, trying to catch any other sounds. My mind was running wild with possibilities. Could it be a hunter out there in the woods, or someone looking for shelter or help? Maybe it was just a curious animal, though it felt too purposeful to be a creature. I held my breath, hoping the footsteps would stop, but they didn't. They continued circling, slow and deliberate, like whoever was out there was waiting for something, or perhaps waiting for me to make a move. By the time the night had stretched on, I was exhausted, but the fear kept me wide awake. I didn't dare fall asleep. Every time I heard a twig snap or a branch rustle, My heart would leap in my chest. The footsteps continued through the night, never stopping, always circling. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, but the silence between the footsteps felt so oppressive. It was like being stalked by a shadow, an unseen presence that was always near. Just as I thought I couldn't take it any longer, the footsteps stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the sound of the crunching steps. I lay there in the dark, wide-eyed, straining my ears for any movement, any hint of what was going on outside. But nothing came. It was dead silent, and for the first time that night I allowed myself to close my eyes and breathe deeply. When the sun finally rose, I quickly packed up my things, eager to leave. I didn't even bother to start a fire. I was just ready to get out of there, to get back to the safety of the car and the world I knew. As I stepped out of the tent, the morning light sliced through the trees. But something caught my eye. Just a few feet from the entrance of my tent was a tree, and in its trunk was a knife. A large hunting knife was wedged deep into the bark, the handle covered in dirt, and the blade reflecting the morning sun. I froze. My blood ran cold. The knife was too close to my tent. I could barely believe what I was seeing. The night's footsteps, the pacing around my tent had all made sense now. Someone had been out there, not just watching, but leaving a warning, or maybe marking their territory. I stepped closer, the reality of the situation sinking in. The knife wasn't there by accident. It was deliberate. Whoever had been out there had been closer than I'd realized. I didn't know how long the knife had been there, or if it had been there the entire night, but the fact that it was so close to my tent made my stomach churn. I hadn't heard anyone approach or leave, and I was certain no one had come near me during the night. It was as if the person had been right there, just beyond the fabric of my tent, watching, waiting. I looked around, trying to see if there was any sign of tracks or other evidence of who had been out there, but the ground was soft and undisturbed. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed my gear and started packing up in a panic. My hands were shaking and I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. The thoughts of what could have happened if I'd fallen asleep, if I hadn't stayed so alert, made me feel sick. I was incredibly lucky. Whoever had been circling my tent could have easily done worse than just leave a knife behind. The idea that they were so close or deliberate in their actions left me with an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. When I got back to my car, I immediately drove straight to the nearest ranger station. I didn't even bother to explain everything at first. I just handed them the knife. The rangers took it seriously, but they didn't have much to go on. No fingerprints, no real clues as to who had left it or why. They assured me they'd look into it, but I knew the woods were vast and the likelihood of finding anyone was slim. I never went camping alone again after that. The feeling of being watched, of knowing that someone had been that close to me, stayed with me for a long time. I couldn't shake the image of that knife in the tree, wedged there like a marker, like a message that I would never truly understand. Story 2. I had just come home from work one evening when I noticed something unusual in my mailbox. It wasn't a letter or a bill, but a small, unmarked USB drive tucked neatly inside. There was no return address, no name, not even a smudge of handwriting. Just a plain black drive with no sign of how it got there, or why it was there in the first place. At first I thought it was some sort of mistake or a weird promotional thing. I've received strange mail before, advertisements, unsolicited packages, but something about this felt different. I considered tossing it into the trash without a second thought. The curiosity got the better of me. I plugged the USB drive into my laptop, half expecting some cheesy video or spam file. What I found instead stopped my heart. The first file I clicked on was a folder labeled simply for you. Inside were several photos. At first they seemed ordinary landscape shots, street scenes, things that didn't make much sense. But as I scrolled through, my breath hitched. The last few pictures were of me, in my bedroom, sleeping. The images were taken from an angle that was impossible to miss. They were clear and detailed shots of me lying in my bed, completely unaware. The photos were taken at different times over the course of a week, each one showing me in various positions, curled up in blankets, peacefully asleep. I sat frozen, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of it. How did someone get into my house? And why would they take pictures of me like this? I clicked through each photo, my anxiety growing with each one. The photos weren't taken with a camera I recognized, and they didn't look like they'd been snapped from an obvious position. I couldn't tell if they were taken from outside my window or from somewhere inside the house hidden in the shadows. Either way, the thought that someone had been watching me while I slept made my stomach turn. My fingers trembled as I reached for my phone. I couldn't ignore this. I had to report it. I called the police and explained everything. How I found the drive, the pictures of me sleeping, the complete lack of any identifying information. The officer who answered seemed concerned but kept reassuring me that they'd look into it. "Well, start with a canvassing of your neighborhood," he said. "Do you recognize anyone or any vehicles around your house?" But I didn't. My neighborhood was quiet, almost too quiet. No one stood out as suspicious. The police arrived about an hour later to take the USB drive for evidence, but I couldn't shake the sense of dread that gnawed at me. They asked if I had noticed anything strange recently. Strange sounds, unfamiliar cars, or people hanging around, but I hadn't. I lived alone and my life had been relatively uneventful. The only thing that seemed off was finding the drive. Over the next few days, I stayed on high alert. I kept the curtains drawn and double-checked that all the doors were locked before going to bed. The police kept in touch, but there was no news. They couldn't find any fingerprints on the drive, and the images were inconclusive. No license plates, no clear view of the person who had taken them. The only thing they could confirm was that the photos had been taken at different times and at least one appeared to have been taken from inside the house. I tried to push the fear to the back of my mind, but every night when I went to sleep I couldn't help but wonder, what if someone was still watching? What if they had been in my house before and I hadn't known? My thoughts spiraled, each one more paranoid than the last. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside had me jumping out of my skin. I started checking the locks on my doors and windows more frequently, even when I knew I had already checked them. Days turned into weeks, and the police still had no leads. They asked me to check if anything in my house had been disturbed, but everything appeared normal. Nothing was missing, nothing was broken. The photos were the only evidence, and they couldn't figure out who took them or how they even knew where I lived. The case went cold, and I was left to deal with the lingering fear alone. One evening, a few weeks later, I received another package in the mail. This time it wasn't a USB drive, but a letter. I hesitated before opening it, my stomach churning with dread. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message written in neat handwriting. "Did you enjoy the photos? It'll be back soon." My blood ran cold. I couldn't breathe. I slammed the letter down on the counter and dialed the police once again. This time they came over quickly, taking the letter and promising to investigate further. But again, they found nothing. No fingerprints, no traces of DNA, no way to track down who sent it. I was no longer just scared. I was terrified. The worst part was that I couldn't pinpoint when it had started. I couldn't even be sure if the photos had been taken over a week or longer. Was someone inside my house while I slept? Was this a random act, or had I unknowingly crossed paths with someone who was watching me, waiting for the right moment? The following weeks were a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights. I moved all my valuables into a safe place and began staying with friends or at a nearby hotel whenever I could. I didn't want to be alone anymore. I kept all the blinds drawn and installed cameras around the house in a desperate attempt to feel safe. But even with the added security, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, lurking just out of sight. The police, while sympathetic, couldn't do much more. They continued to check leads, but the trail was cold. The letter and photos all pointed to something sinister, but no one could explain who was behind it. Eventually the case was closed, but the fear never fully left. I never found out who sent those photos or why they chose me. I didn't even know if they'd stopped watching or if they were still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike again. To this day, I still get the occasional uneasy feeling when I walk past my mailbox. Every time I hear the sound of something being dropped inside, my heart races. Then I'm reminded of the time someone watched me from the shadows without ever leaving a trace. I had just finished a long day at work. My mind was cluttered with thoughts of deadlines, meetings, and a dozen things I still needed to do. The parking garage was almost empty when I arrived. The quiet, fluorescent lights above echoed in the cold concrete space. I parked my car on the third level, not paying much attention to the few vehicles scattered across the floor. It wasn't until I started walking toward the elevator that I noticed a car following me, its headlights blinking on and off in the dim light. At first I thought nothing of it. Maybe the driver was just trying to find a spot like I was. But as I continued walking, the car seemed to follow me at a steady pace. I would walk to the next row and the car would turn with me, keeping its distance just enough to remain behind. It wasn't a coincidence anymore. The more I moved, the more the car stayed with me. It didn't speed up or slow down. It just mirrored my movements as though it were part of my routine. I tried to shake it off, thinking I was being paranoid. After all, there were plenty of reasons why someone might be moving through the garage, right? But something about the situation fell off. As I reached the farthest row of parked cars, I glanced over my shoulder, hoping to see the car moving past me. But it didn't. It was still there, sitting at the corner, its headlights on, and staring at me like it was waiting for me to make the next move. The air around me suddenly felt heavier, charged with an unspoken tension. My heart began to pound in my chest. I picked up my pace, trying to ignore the sensation of being watched. I didn't want to look back, but I couldn't help myself. The car had followed me all the way to the furthest spot on the floor. I made a sharp turn and quickly headed toward the nearest elevator, praying that the doors would open as soon as I reached them. But as I reached the entrance, I heard the familiar sound of an engine revving, followed by the soft crunch of tires on the concrete floor. It was still behind me. I pressed the elevator button repeatedly, hoping for a quick escape. But the elevator felt agonizingly far away. The car was still moving slowly behind me, its headlights casting long shadows across the rows of parked vehicles. I could feel my palms begin to sweat as the elevator doors finally opened. But before I could step inside, I glanced to the side and saw the car stopping 2 spaces away from mine. The driver didn't move. They just sat there, their face hidden behind tinted windows, staring at me. My stomach dropped. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get into the elevator and leave. But my feet felt frozen to the ground. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and finally stepped into the elevator. The doors slid closed behind me, but as they did, I noticed the car hadn't moved. It stayed parked, the engine idling, while I ascended to the ground floor. I watched the light indicators above the elevator doors change one by one as I descended. My mind was racing, filled with questions. Was this a coincidence? Was it someone I knew? Or was it just some random stranger? My breath came in shallow bursts. My thoughts were scrambling. I kept my eyes on the numbers above the door as the elevator made its slow descent. I couldn't stop thinking about the driver's face hidden behind the glass, just staring at me without any indication of what they wanted. When the elevator finally reached the ground floor, I stepped out as quickly as I could and walked briskly toward the exit. I looked back once, but I didn't see the car behind me anymore. It was as if it had disappeared into thin air. A wave of relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Something about the entire encounter felt off, like I had narrowly avoided something I didn't understand. I couldn't shake the feeling that the car was still there, just waiting for me to turn around. The rest of the evening was a blur. I made my way to my car, not daring to glance around the parking lot. I had parked in a different section this time, trying to avoid any more potential encounters. When I got into my car, I locked the doors and took a few deep breaths, trying to calm my racing heart. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that car pulling in behind me. But there was nothing, just a dimly lit lot stretching out behind me. I drove home that night with a sense of unease lingering in the back of my mind. The encounter replayed in my head over and over, each detail more unsettling than the last. Who was the driver? Why had they followed me? And why had they stayed parked there, just staring? I couldn't shake the image of their unmoving figure, their face hidden behind the windows as if they were waiting for something. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the incident. I was more aware of my surroundings than ever, checking the parking lot before I even got out of my car. Every time I entered the garage, I felt a lingering sense of unease, but nothing happened. No car followed me, no strange stares from hidden drivers. Still, I couldn't erase the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't until a week later that the memory of that night resurfaced again, stronger than before. I was walking to my car when I noticed a familiar vehicle parked a few spaces away. The same make, the same model, and most importantly, the same tinted windows. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't be sure it was the same car, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I approached. This time, I didn't wait for the elevator. I walked quickly to my car, fumbled with my keys and got inside as fast as I could. I glanced over at the vehicle as I pulled out of the garage, but it was gone, vanishing as suddenly as it had appeared. I took a deep breath, feeling a slight wave of relief, but the gnawing sense of discomfort remained. I couldn't help but wonder, was it the same car? Was someone following me again, or had my mind been playing tricks on me? I still don't know for sure who was in that car, or why they followed me, but the thought of it haunts me every time I drive into that parking garage now. I can shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that someone is always lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to make themselves known again. Story. It had been an ordinary Thursday. At least I thought. I woke up, went through my usual morning routine and headed out the door to run errands. The weather was perfect for a quick walk, so I decided to leave my car behind and enjoy the sunshine as I made my way to the local cafe. My mind was occupied with a mix of mundane tasks, picking up groceries, making a quick stop at the dry cleaner, and then catching up on some emails when I returned home. Nothing out of the ordinary until the call came. I had just gotten back home, grocery bags in hand, when my phone rang. The screen flashed an unknown caller, a typical sign that it might be a telemarketer or spam call. I almost didn't pick up, but something about it negated me. I answered, holding the phone up to my ear with a sigh. "Hello?" I said, trying to keep my tone light. A pause on the other end of the line. Then a voice, low, calm, and almost too familiar, spoke. "You're wearing the green jacket today, the one with the zipper pockets on the front." I froze, my blood running cold. I looked down at my outfit, confirming that yes, I was indeed wearing that very jacket. A chill ran down my spine. "I see you walked to the cafe around 10:15 this morning." The voice continued, its calm tone now sending a wave of unease through me. "You ordered a large iced coffee and sat by the window for about 20 minutes. I could feel the world around me start to close in. How could they know that? I hadn't told anyone my plans for the day. There was no way they could have seen me, not unless they were following me. I took a shaky breath, trying to steady myself. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice trembling more than I intended. My heart was racing now, my mind trying to piece together what was happening. Was this some kind of prank, a weird coincidence? But something told me it wasn't. The voice didn't answer my question. Instead, it simply kept talking, each sentence more unsettling than the last. "After you went to the dry cleaners, you picked up your shirts, and I noticed you ran into someone you seemed to know. A quick chat, but you didn't linger." My mind was reeling. I had been at the dry cleaner alone, as far as I knew. I didn't remember anyone following me, but how could I be sure? Then, the voice continued. "You walked to the grocery store, grabbed a loaf of bread, some eggs and 2 bottles of red wine." My stomach dropped. It was as if the person had been right there with me all day, silently observing, noting every movement, every decision I made. I thought back to the grocery store. There hadn't been anyone close enough to be watching me, had there? "Where are you?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper now. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for a moment before the voice spoke again. But this time it was different. It wasn't calm anymore. It was almost amused. "I'm everywhere," they said softly. The words sent a jolt of panic through me, and my hands started to shake as I clutched the phone tighter. "I'm closer than you think." I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing, trying to come up with an explanation, but I couldn't find one. I hadn't seen anyone suspicious during my errands. No one who would make me feel this uneasy. My pulse was pounding in my ears. I needed to get off the phone, but I couldn't bring myself to hang up. Part of me wanted to know who this was, what they wanted. Another part of me was terrified to hear what they would say next. The voice broke the silence again. "You should check your front door. There's something there for you." My heart skipped a beat. I glanced over at the door, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I hadn't heard anyone knock, hadn't seen anything outside through the peephole. But then again, I had been too preoccupied with the call to pay much attention. Without another word, the line went dead. I stood there for a moment, frozen, my mind grappling with the idea that someone had been watching me all day. Who could it be? And why? My instinct screamed at me to hang up and call the police. But something deep down told me to check the door first. Maybe it was just a prank, a strange coincidence, but the voice had been too detailed, too accurate for it to be just that. I moved cautiously toward the front door, my heart pounding louder with every step. I reached for the doorknob, but my hand hovered just above it. My thoughts raced back to the voice's last words. "There's something there for you." What could it be? I hadn't seen anyone outside. I wasn't expecting a package. Slowly I opened the door, and first I saw nothing but the empty space of my small porch. Then my eyes fell on something at the base of the doorframe, a small envelope, plain and unmarked. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't remember seeing it there when I first came in. It had been placed carefully, almost deliberately, right in front of me. My hands trembled as I reached for it, the paper cool against my fingertips. I opened it with cautious precision, almost afraid to see what was inside. There was no note, no letter, just a single photograph. I held it up to the light, my hands shaking as I looked at the image. It was a picture of me, taken from behind, walking through the parking lot of the grocery store earlier that afternoon. My face was invisible, but the unmistakable red of my jacket stood out in the frame. My stomach twisted in horror as I realized the photo had been taken moments after I'd been talking to a friend outside. There were no markings on the back of the photo, no clue as to who had sent it. I stared at it for a long time, my mind spinning. Whoever had been watching me was getting bolder. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, now felt like a terrifying certainty. I backed away from the door, locking it behind me and pulling the curtain shut. I looked around my apartment, but the air felt thick and heavy with a presence I couldn't shake. Whoever had called me knew too much. They had been watching me in ways I couldn't understand. I wanted to call the police, but part of me felt like I needed more evidence, something concrete to show them. But I didn't know what that would even look like. All I knew was that the feeling of being watched was no longer a paranoid thought. It was my reality, and now it seemed there was no escaping it. I had been on the road for hours, my stomach gnawing at me for a break. The rest stop appeared out of nowhere, a small but welcoming place with a few trucks parked around it. The building was old but well kept, with clean signs and a faint smell of fresh coffee in the air. I pulled into the lot, eager to stretch my legs and get some relief. The restrooms were tucked around the back of the building, a simple, unremarkable structure with faded white paint. I walked up the short path. The only sounds were the faint hum of traffic and the occasional creak of the wooden door as the wind moved through it. I was in and out quickly. The bathroom wasn't crowded, and I was relieved to get a moment to myself. After using the restroom, I headed to one of the stalls, a bit of discomfort still lingering from my long drive. It was when I tried to leave the stall that I realized something was wrong. The door, which had always opened without a problem before, was now completely stuck. I tugged at it, thinking maybe it was just a little jammed. The hinges squeaked slightly, but it wouldn't budge. I twisted the lock a few times, trying to loosen it, but the door didn't move an inch. I was starting to feel the pressure of being trapped in this small, windowless space. I called out at first, but my voice felt weak against the quiet of the bathroom. There was no answer, no movement outside. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm myself, then pushed harder on the door. The hinges creaked again, but it was as if the door had grown heavier. Panic began to settle in. What if no one came? I could feel the sweat beginning to trickle down my back as I tried again and again to wrench the door free. It felt absurd, like I was in some twisted joke, but there was no one around to help. I stood there for a while, my fingers white from the pressure of gripping the door, trying to gather my thoughts. The bathroom was silent, except for the occasional sounds of vehicles outside. It was unnervingly quiet. The rest stop seemed deserted now, as if everyone had vanished, and I was the only one left. I tried shouting again, hoping someone would hear me. My voice bounced off the sterile walls, but there was no response. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and my frustration started to turn to fear. It was a bathroom, locked on purpose. It was I who had been locked in here by someone. My heart began to race, and I could hear it pounding in my ears. I tried pulling the door again, this time with everything I had, and felt a small shift. It wasn't much, but I thought I might have loosened it a little. My hope flared for a moment, and I pushed harder, my palms sweating against the cool metal. Finally, the door gave way with a loud screech, and I stumbled backward into the stall. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was short-lived. As I stood up, I noticed something that sent a chill through me. Just outside the stall, standing in the doorway, was a man. He was tall, his face shadowed by a cap, and he was holding a camera. His expression was unreadable, and he didn't say a word as he stood there, just staring at me. The air seemed to freeze between us. I froze too, unsure of what to do. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Why was he standing there? How long had he been there, and why the camera? I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. It was as if his presence paralyzed me. He didn't make a sound, didn't step forward or back, just stood there with his camera in hand. The silence was deafening. Every instant told me to leave, to get away from this man, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. He wasn't threatening, but there was something unsettling about the way he watched me, his gaze never leaving my face. It was as though he were waiting for something, waiting for me to do something. I didn't know. After what felt like an eternity, I finally gathered enough courage to speak. "What do you want?" My voice cracked, shaky from fear that had settled in my chest. The man didn't answer. Instead, he took a slow step toward me, raising the camera as he did. My pulse quickened, and I took a step back. "Please, what are you doing?" I demanded, my voice a little stronger now, though it still quivered. I had no idea what was going on, but I knew I needed to get out of there. Still, he didn't speak. He just kept the camera aimed at me, as if he were waiting for the perfect shot. His movements were slow and deliberate, and it felt like he was assessing me with every movement. It was as though I wasn't a person to him, but just some object to capture, some strange subject to record. I felt panic surge back into my chest. My eyes darted around, searching for a way out, but the only exit was the man blocking the door. I felt trapped again, like the room had closed in on me. I reached for my phone in my pocket, my hands trembling as I pulled it out, praying the signal would work. The man didn't seem to notice or care as I unlocked my phone and quickly dialed the number for the police. The phone rang 3 times, and by the 4th ring the man finally took a step back. His eyes didn't leave me, but he lowered the camera. I heard the distant sound of sirens growing louder outside, and for the first time since I'd seen him, the man took one last look at me and slowly walked away. He didn't run or hurry. Instead, he moved with a slow, deliberate pace, as if he were satisfied with whatever he had done. I didn't wait. I pushed past him, my heart pounding, and ran out of the bathroom as fast as my legs could carry me. The cool air hit my face like a slap, and I didn't look back. I only stopped when I saw the police car pulling into the lot. I was shaken, terrified, but I was finally safe. The man was never found, and the authorities couldn't track him down, but I would never forget his eyes, the way he stood there silently, camera in hand.
I never stopped at that rest stop again.
It was just after sunset when I started walking home. The sky was tinged with orange and pink, the kind of colors that made the evening feel peaceful and calm. I usually enjoyed the walk, the quiet of the neighborhood streets, the sound of my shoes tapping against the pavement, but tonight was different. I noticed after a few blocks that someone was walking behind me. At first I thought it was just coincidence. Maybe they were heading in the same direction, or would turn off onto another street soon. But as the minutes passed, I began to realize that the footsteps behind me were always there, steady, just a few paces back. I quickened my pace, but so did theirs. I turned left onto a side street, hoping to shake them, but the person followed. A sense of unease settled in my stomach, creeping up like a cold shiver. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was being paranoid, but the feeling didn't go away. The sound of their footsteps grew louder and closer. I was now nearing the last stretch of my walk, my street just a block away.
I had to do something.
I couldn't just let this stranger follow me all the way to my door without knowing who they were or what they wanted. I stopped abruptly and turned to face the person who was now only a few feet behind me. They froze for a moment, as if caught off guard by my sudden move. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I forced myself to speak. "Why are you following me?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment the only sound was the distant hum of traffic. The person didn't immediately respond. They looked down at the ground almost nervously, as if weighing their answer. I didn't move, didn't even breathe, waiting for them to say something, anything. Finally, they lifted their head and looked directly at me. Their eyes weren't particularly hostile, but not friendly either. There was something about them, something unsettling in their gaze. "I just want to see where you live," they said, their voice calm, almost too calm. It took me a moment to process what they had just said. "Excuse me," I asked, my voice trembling now. This didn't make any sense. Who says something like that? I took a small step back, suddenly very aware of how vulnerable I felt standing there alone with this stranger. "Why?" I added, trying to force the words out despite the lump in my throat. The person shrugged, not offering any explanation, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. "Curiosity," they said simply. "I've seen you around here before, just wanted to know where you lived." The strangest thing was that they didn't seem dangerous. At least not in the way I had imagined someone following me would be. There was no aggression in their tone, no sudden movements, nothing that screamed immediate threat, but the words hung in the air, making the whole situation feel off, unsettling in a way I couldn't explain. "Why would you want to know that?" I asked, now backing up towards the street, where more people might be walking, where I might be able to get help if needed. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of this strange encounter, but no logical explanation came to mind. The person just stared at me, their expression unreadable. Like I said, they repeated, "Curiosity." I didn't know what else to say. I had no idea if this person was harmless or if they were just waiting for me to turn my back so they could do something else. The thought made my stomach churn, but I refused to show my fear. I straightened up, making sure my posture was firm, even though my nerves were shot. "Okay, well, I'm done talking," I said, my voice shaking. "You need to leave." The stranger didn't move for a moment, just stood there, their gaze never leaving me. I could feel my pulse racing, my mind screaming at me to run, but I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing my fear. After a long pause, the person finally took a step back, as if considering something, then not at once, as if they had made up their mind. "Fine," they said, and turned around without another word. I watched them walk away, my body tense, my hands still trembling from the encounter. As soon as they were out of sight, I bolted the last few steps to my street, my heart still hammering in my chest. I didn't look back. I couldn't bring myself to. The person's words echoed in my mind as I hurried to my front door. Curiosity. It didn't make sense. Why would someone follow me, watch me, and then say something like that? It felt like they were testing me, pushing boundaries to see if I would react. Or maybe they were just insane. I stepped inside and locked the door behind me, leaning against it for a moment to catch my breath. I felt an overwhelming need to check all the windows to make sure every lock was secure. The sense of being watched didn't leave me. I couldn't shake the thought that the person hadn't just been curious. They had been trying to learn something about me, to get too close, to cross some invisible line. As I paced through my apartment, I wondered how much of my life I had been unknowingly exposing to people. How many others had seen me around and thought it was okay to follow me, to invade my space just because they were curious. It was a chilling thought, one that made me second-guess every stranger I passed in the street from that moment on. That night, I stayed up late, my mind racing, unable to fully calm down. I kept thinking about the encounter, wondering if I had done the right thing by confronting the person, or if it would have been safer to just keep walking and pretend like I hadn't noticed. But the words they had spoken kept replaying in my head. "I just want to see where you live." Those words were too casual, too comfortable, too familiar. It made me question whether there was more to the story that I wasn't hearing. I didn't sleep well that night. The feeling of being watched and being unknowingly observed stayed with me for days after, and I couldn't shake the thought that the stranger wasn't done with me yet. Story. I didn't think much of it at first, or my coworker, Alan, offered to give me a ride home after our late shift at the office. I thought it was just a friendly gesture. He had always been quiet but polite, and we'd had a few conversations during breaks about work, the weather, and the usual small talk. There wasn't anything particularly alarming about it, especially since my car was in the shop and I was relying on public transportation. He drove a modest sedan, nothing flashy or out of the ordinary. As we chatted on the way, I couldn't help but notice how much more talkative he seemed outside of the office. He told me a bit about his family, his hobbies, and even mentioned that he lived not too far from me. I didn't think much of it at the time, just another coworker making polite conversation. He dropped me off at my apartment building, waved, and that was that. I didn't see him again outside of work for weeks. Then, one evening, just after I'd gotten home from work, I heard a knock at my door. It was a little after 8 o'clock, a time when most people were either settled into their homes or winding down for the night. I wasn't expecting anyone. I peeked through the peephole and froze when I saw Alan standing in the hallway. He was holding a small bag in his hand, and his expression looked oddly serious. Confused, I opened the door just a crack. "Hey, Alan," I said cautiously, trying to sound polite. "What's up, bum?" He smiled, but it was a tight, strange smile that didn't seem to reach his eyes. "Hey, I just wanted to make sure you were okay," he said, his voice calm but too measured. "I've been watching to make sure you're safe." I blinked, not sure if I had heard him correctly. What do you mean watching? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. Is everything okay? Alan looked around as if to check if anyone was listening, and then leaned in slightly. I've been keeping an eye on the building, he said softly. I know you're new here, and I just wanted to make sure nothing had happened to you. His smile widened, but it didn't help the feeling of unease that was creeping up my spine. My heart began to race. I hadn't invited him over. I hadn't even asked for his help, and the thought that he had been monitoring my apartment without me knowing was unsettling. I don't need you to do that, I said, my voice firming despite my growing discomfort. Thank you for the offer, but it's really not necessary. He didn't seem to take the hint. Instead, he stepped forward just a little, as though he were trying to come inside. I just wanted to make sure you're not alone, he said, his tone too insistent. People here can be weird. I've lived in this building for a while now, and I know what's going on. I could feel my body tense and a cold shiver ran down my back. Fine, I said quickly, trying to shut the door, but he put his hand out, blocking it just before it could close. My heart was racing. Something didn't feel right, and every instinct I had screamed at me to get away from the door. His eyes softened, but it didn't make his presence any less intimidating. I'm just looking out for you, he repeated, his voice still eerily calm. You've been so quiet at work lately. I thought you might need a friend. I swallowed, trying to steady myself. I'm okay, I said, my voice now a little sharper. I don't need any help. Really? I took a deep breath and pushed the door with more force, creating enough space between us. Please leave. There was a long, drawn-out pause, and for a moment I thought he might argue, but then, to my relief, he stepped back. Okay, he said, his tone still too calm. But remember, I'm just looking out for you. He turned and walked away, slowly, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. I stood frozen in the doorway for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. I had a bad feeling about Alan now, something that gnawed at me deep in my gut. The whole situation felt off, and I didn't know what to do with the unease that clung to me long after he'd left. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. The words I'd been watching repeated in my mind over and over. At work, I kept my distance from Alan. He seemed unfazed by my coldness, continuing to make small talk, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something more was going on beneath the surface. I kept my apartment door locked tighter than usual and avoided the windows at night, even though there was no real reason to believe he might be watching me. But the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't help but wonder, had he really been keeping an eye on me? Had he been lurking around my apartment? A week later, I received a text message from an unknown number. The message was short and simple. Hope you're doing okay. He'll be around if you need anything. There was no name attached, but I recognized the area code. It was Alan's. My heart sank. I hadn't given him my number, and he certainly hadn't asked for it. My fingers hovered over the phone as I debated whether or not to reply. I didn't want to engage, but at the same time I needed to know more. What was he after? Instead of responding, I blocked the number and immediately called my best friend Jess. I told her everything about Alan's strange visit, the message, and how I felt like I was being watched. She listened quietly, then said, "You need to report him. This sounds like harassment. He's crossed the line." I didn't want to escalate things, but I knew she was right. I went to the building management the next day and explained the situation, showing them the text message and telling them about Alan's visit. They promised they'd look into it, but I could see the concern in their eyes. They offered to change my locks and install a security camera in the hallway. The following weeks were tense. I never saw Alan again at work or around the building, but the unease never fully left me. I kept waiting for a message, a knock on my door, or some sign that he was still lurking somewhere. I tried to tell myself it was over, that I was safe, but the thought of him watching from some hidden corner haunted me long after he was gone. I had just moved into a new apartment, and it didn't take long for me to realize that I needed a 24-hour laundromat. The one closest to me wasn't exactly in the best part of town, but I didn't have many options. I usually went at night because it was quieter, less crowded, and I could get in and out without anyone noticing. The fluorescent lights flickered in the dim space, casting a strange glow on the rows of machines. The hum of the washers and dryers was oddly soothing, but it wasn't long before I noticed a man who seemed to be there every time I visited. At first, I didn't think much of it. He was always sitting in the same corner, far from the machines, near the stack of old magazines and a vending machine. He was an older man, maybe in his mid-50s, with unkempt grey hair and a beard that looked like it hadn't been shaved in days. He usually had a large overstuffed bag with him, and he would just sit there staring off into space, barely acknowledging the other customers. I tried not to make eye contact as I didn't want to seem rude, but it felt strange that he was always there. Night after night, I went to the laundromat and he was there. It became a weird kind of routine. He would sit in the same spot, and I would load my laundry into one of the machines, trying to avoid the unsettling feeling his presence gave me. He never seemed to be doing anything in particular. Sometimes he'd look at his phone, sometimes he'd just stare ahead, but he never interacted with anyone, never spoke, and never seemed to have any other purpose than to be there. At first, I chalked it up to just another odd, lonely person who didn't have anywhere else to be. But after a few days, I started to notice something that made my stomach churn. His eyes would follow me whenever I walked around the laundromat. Could feel them on my back as I moved from machine to machine. Every time I looked over, he was still sitting in the same spot, but his gaze would quickly shift away, almost like he had been caught doing something he wasn't supposed to. I tried not to let it bother me, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. One night, I even considered changing my routine by going to a different laundromat, but the thought of it seemed like overkill. I didn't want to let the strange man dictate my choices, so I kept going back. It wasn't until one particular night that everything changed. I had finished folding my laundry and decided to take a quick trip to the bathroom before heading home. The laundromat was quiet, with only the sound of dryers whirring in the background, and I figured I would be in and out in a minute. As I walked toward the back of the building, I glanced at the corner where the man usually sat. He was there, but for some reason, this time his bag was open, on the floor beside him. He was rifling through it, pulling out clothes that weren't his. I hesitated for a second, my heart beating faster. I had no idea why he was going through his bag like that, but it didn't sit right with me. It wasn't until I came back from the bathroom, maybe 5 minutes later, that I found out what was going on. As I stepped back into the main room, I noticed him crouched beside my laundry basket, going through my clothes. His hands were quick, moving from shirt to pants, rummaging through everything. I froze, standing in the doorway watching him in disbelief. I don't know how long I stood there, my mind racing, trying to process what I was seeing. It wasn't just that he was going through my clothes, it was the way he was doing it. He wasn't just sorting them or looking for something. He was inspecting them, touching them, like he was studying them, trying to figure something out. My heart skipped a beat as I realized I had just left my clothes unattended while I went to the bathroom, and he had taken full advantage of it. I wanted to confront him, to say something, but the words stuck in my throat. He didn't seem to notice me standing there. His focus was still completely on my clothes.
I knew I needed to act fast.
Slowly, I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. I considered leaving, just walking out and never coming back. But something in me told me I couldn't let him get away with it. I took a deep breath and called out to him, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey, what are you doing?" He froze, his hands still hovering over my clothes. For a moment, everything was silent, the only sound the buzz of the dryer. Then he slowly stood up, turning toward me. His face was blank and expressionless, like he hadn't just been caught going through my things. His eyes met mine for a split second, before he mumbled something under his breath, something I couldn't quite make out. Then, without another word, he turned and quickly grabbed his bag, shuffling towards the door. I stood there, dumbfounded, as he hurried out into the night. The door slammed behind him, leaving me alone in the laundromat. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to go after him, to call the police, but my mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Why had he been going through my clothes? What was his purpose? And why did he look so unbothered by the fact that I had caught him? The rest of the night passed in a blur. I quickly finished gathering my things, locking my basket and laundry bag in my car. I couldn't shake the image of him, crouched beside my clothes, touching them with a strange sense of purpose. I felt dirty, violated, even though he hadn't taken anything. But the fact that he had been so calm, so methodical in his actions, made it clear that this wasn't the first time he had done something like this. I haven't gone back to that laundromat since. Every time I think about it, I can't help but wonder how many other people he had done this to. How many other times he had hidden in that corner, waiting for someone to turn their back. The thought of it makes my skin crawl. Story I woke up to the strange sensation of cool air brushing against my skin. My eyes flickered open, then for a moment I couldn't place what felt off. I was still half asleep, the weight of the blankets keeping me in place. But when I turned my head and saw the faint light slipping through the crack of my bedroom door, my heart skipped a beat. I always made sure to close and lock my door before going to bed. It was a habit I'd developed over the years, a small comfort that made me feel safe. But now the door was wide open. I could see the dark and still hallway outside. The door had been firmly shut when I had gone to sleep. Had I forgotten to lock it? No, I was sure I hadn't. My heart began to race as I sat up, pulling the blankets off me, my feet hitting the cold floor. I slowly got up, my mind spinning with possibilities. Could it have been the wind? But the window was closed, and the air outside was still. The door hadn't simply been pushed open by a draft. No, someone had opened it. I walked over to the door, my legs unsteady, and peered into the hallway. It was empty, just the normal silence that filled the apartment at night. Nothing was out of place. I glanced back at the bed, wondering if I had somehow missed something while I was asleep. But no, everything seemed normal. There were no signs of a struggle, no disturbance on the floor. Yet the feeling of unease settled over me like a heavy fog. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up as I reached for the door and closed it gently. My hands were shaky as I locked it again, the click of the bolt loud in the stillness. As I stepped back, I noticed something strange, a small mark on the inside of the doorknob. It wasn't there when I had gone to bed. I leaned in closer, my breath catching in my throat. There were scratches, small, deep gouges that seemed to be etched into the metal. The scratches were in a pattern, almost deliberate, as if someone had been trying to pick the lock. My pulse quickened. I felt a chill run down my spine as I traced the marks with my fingers. Whoever had done this had been close, too close. I stepped back from the door, my mind racing. I had locked the door when I went to sleep. I was certain of it, but someone had gotten inside, or at least attempted to. The thought made my stomach twist. I had no idea how long they had been in my room. Had they been watching me? I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure. But the sense of dread only grew. I checked the other locks on the door, making sure they were secure. But the scratches on the doorknob still haunted me. Who had done this? Was someone trying to break in? The idea of someone getting into my space, into my sanctuary, made me feel vulnerable. I couldn't shake the image of someone standing there in the dark, trying to pry their way into my room. The thought was enough to make my chest tighten with anxiety. I decided to check the rest of the apartment, hoping that maybe there was some explanation for what had happened. I walked through the kitchen, the living room, and even the bathroom. Everything seemed normal, just the way I had left it. No signs of forced entry, nothing out of place. But that didn't make me feel better. It only made the situation more confusing. I went back to my bedroom, my eyes still drawn to the doorknob. The scratches were so distinct, so intentional, like someone had been trying to unlock it. But why? Why not just open the door? Why go through the trouble of picking the lock in the first place? My mind whirred with questions, none of which had any easy answers. I sat on the edge of my bed, my hands trembling as I picked up my phone and called my best friend. She answered on the second ring, and I quickly explained what had happened. She tried to calm me down, reminding me that it could have been a mistake or some kind of accident. Maybe I had just forgotten to lock it, she suggested. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I ended the call feeling a little more unsettled than before. My friend had offered a comforting explanation, but it didn't feel right. The scratches on the doorknob were too specific to be deliberate. They didn't make sense. Whoever had done this had been in my room, close enough that I hadn't even woken up. The thought made my skin crawl. I decided to check my phone for any messages, anything that might explain what had happened. As I scrolled through my notifications, nothing stood out. No missed calls, no strange texts. But I felt the eerie weight of the situation settle back in. I had no explanation for the open door or the scratches, and that unsettled me more than anything. There was a sense of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. I spent the next few hours pacing around the apartment, double-checking every lock, every window. I felt like I was losing my mind. The fear was beginning to consume me, with someone stalking me. Had they been watching me while I slept? The thought of someone knowing my routine, knowing how I always locked the door at night, made my heart race. I couldn't relax. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still here, just waiting. Finally, I decided to call the police. I explained the situation to the operator, my voice shaking as I told her about the open door and the scratches on the doorknob. She reassured me that they would send someone to check things out, but I wasn't sure what good it would do. The apartment felt suffocating now, like the walls were closing in around me. What was I supposed to do in the meantime? Stay in my room, stay locked away, in my safe space. When the police arrived, they looked around the apartment, but they found no signs of forced entry beyond the scratches on the door. They checked the locks, the windows, and the perimeter of the building. They didn't seem to find anything unusual, but they suggested I be extra cautious. It was a reminder that there was no real way to know if someone had been inside, and that thought was hardest to shake. As they left, I locked the door again more carefully this time. The scratches on the doorknob lingered in my mind, a constant reminder that someone had been here, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The feeling of vulnerability never left me, and as I lay in bed that night, the fear of being watched returned. I closed my eyes, hoping for sleep, but the image of the scratches haunted me.